Book 3, Chapter 21. Saraswati explains the practice of meditation, astral travel. Saraswati continues speaking to Leela. Soon after death occasions a lack of physical senses. The sight of the world appears to the soul as if he were seeing it with open eyes when he was living. Before him is presented the circle of the sky and its sides with a cycle of its seasons and times. He is shown the deeds of his pious and mundane acts, as if they were to continue to eternity. Objects never before seen or thought of also offer themselves to his view, like the sight of his own death in a dream, as if they were the prints in his memory. But the infinity of objects appearing in the empty sphere of the non-physical intellect is mere illusion, and the baseless city of the world, like a castle in the sky, is only the creation of imagination. Memory of the past world makes it known to us. Therefore, the length of a kalpa age and the shortness of the moment are only false impressions proceeding from the speed and slowness of our thoughts. Therefore, knowledge based upon previous memories or otherwise is of two kinds, and things known without their cause are attributed to divine intelligence. We are also conscious of thoughts that we have not thought of before in our minds, such as we often have in our dreams. Another may remind us of our deceased parents, so we think of them. Sometimes genius supersedes the province of memory, as in the first creation or discovery of a thing, which afterwards is continued by its memory. According to some, those visible worlds are said to have remained in their ideal state in the divine mind. According to others, there were no pre-existent notions of these in the mind of God. According to some others, the world manifested itself not from memory, but by the power and will of God. Still others maintain it to be the production of a sudden, fortuitous combination of intelligence and atomic principles. Completely forgetting the world is called liberation. That cannot be had if consciousness is attached to what is desirable or is averse to the undesirable. It is difficult to effect an entire negation of both one's subjective and objective knowledge of self and the existence of the outer world. Yet nobody can be freed without the obliteration of both. As the fallacy of taking a rope for a snake is not removed until the meaning of the word snake is known to be inapplicable to the rope, so no one can have rest and peace of mind unless he is convinced of the illusory nature of the world. Even with that, a person who is at peace with himself cannot be wholly at rest without divine knowledge, because even though he has rid himself of the devil of the worldliness, the ghost of his inner ignorance may overtake him. The world is certainly a monster in itself without the knowledge of its author, but the difficulty of knowing the first cause has rendered it an impassable wilderness. Leela said, "If memories are the cause of one's reincarnation, then, O goddess, tell me, what were the causes of the birth of the Brahmin couple, without the vestiges of their past memories?" The goddess replied, "Know that Brahma, the first progenitor of mankind, who was absolute in himself, did not retain any vestige of his past memories in him. The firstborn, who had nothing to remember of a prior birth, was born in the lotus with his own intelligence, and not because of his memory. The Lord of creatures, being thus born by chance of his own genius or creative power, and without any assignable cause or design on his part, reflected within himself, 'Now I am become another, and the source of creation.' Whatever is born of itself is like a nothing that was never produced at all, but remains as the absolute intellect itself in the clouds. The Supreme Being is the sole cause of both types of memories, those caused by vestiges of prior impressions and those produced by prior desires. Both conditions of cause and effect are combined in him in the sphere of his consciousness. Therefore, our tranquility can only come from knowing the cause and effect are the same, and that the auxiliary cause is in him. Cause and effect are mere empty words of no significance, because it is the recognition of the universal consciousness that constitutes true wisdom. Nothing seen in the physical world or known in the mental or spiritual world is ever produced. Everything exists within the consciousness of one's own soul. Leela said, "What a wonderful sight you have shown me, O goddess! It is as auspicious as morning light and as brilliant as lightning. Now, goddess, please satisfy my curiosity until I become thoroughly familiar with this knowledge through my intense application and study. Kindly take me to that mountainous place where the Brahmin couple, Vasistha and Arundhati, lived, and show me their house." The goddess replied, "If you want to see that sight, you have to be immaculate. You must give up your personality and your ego sense and attain awareness of the unintelligible consciousness within the soul. Then you will find yourself in an empty atmosphere, situated in a sky that resembles the prospects of earthly men and the apartments of the firmament, or nothing. In this state we shall be able to see them, the field of another's imagination, with all their possessions and without any obstruction. Otherwise, this body is a great barrier in the way of spiritual vision. Leela said, "Tell me kindly, O goddess, the reason why we do not see the other world with these eyes or go there with these bodies." The goddess replied, "The reason is that you take the true future as false, and you believe the untrue present is true. These worlds that are formless appear to your eyes as having form, just like you see the form of a ring when its substance is gold. Gold, though fashioned into a circle, has no curve in it. The Spirit of God appearing in the form of the world is not the world itself. The world is an emptiness full with the Spirit of God. Whatever is visible is like dust appearing to fly over the sea. The ultimate substance of the world is all a false illusion, the true reality in the subjective Brahma alone. Our guides in Vedanta philosophy and the conviction of our consciousness are evidence of this truth. The believer in Brahma sees Brahma alone and no other anywhere. He looks to Brahma through Brahma himself, as the creator and preserver of all, and whose nature includes all other attributes in itself. Brahma is known not only as the author of his work of the creation of the worlds, but as existent of himself, without any causation or auxiliary causation. The practice of meditation trains you to disregard all duality and variety, and to rely only on one unity. Until you are trained through your practice of meditation, you are barred from viewing Brahma in his true light. By constant practice of meditation, we become settled in this belief of unity, and we rest in the Supreme Spirit. Then we find our bodies to be an aerial substance that mixes with the air, and at last, with these our mortal frames, we are able to come to the sight of Brahma. Being endowed with pure enlightened and spiritual frames, astral or subtle bodies, like those of Brahma and the gods, the holy saints are placed in some part of the divine essence. Without the practice of meditation, you cannot approach God with your mortal frame. A soul sullied by physical sensations can never see the image of God. It is impossible for one to arrive at another's castle in the sky when he is unable to see the castle in the sky that he himself imagined. Therefore, give up your gross body and assume your light intellectual frame. Immerse yourself in the practice of yoga so that you may see God face to face. It is possible to labor and build castles in the air in the same way. It is possible through the practice of yoga and in no other way to behold God either with this body or without it. Ever since the creation of this world by the will of Brahma, there have been false conceptions of its existence. It has been attributed to an eternal fate, niyati, by fatalists, and to an illusory power, Maya Shakti or Maya Vadis. Leela asked, "O goddess, you said that we both shall go to the abode of the Brahmin couple. But I ask you, how is this possible? I am able to go there with the pure essence of my sentient soul, but tell me, how will you, who are pure intellect, go to that place?" The goddess replied, "I tell you, lady, divine will is an aerial tree, and its fruits are as unsubstantial as air, having no figure or form or substance to them. Whatever is formed by the will of God from the pure essence of his intelligent nature is only a likeness of himself, and bears little difference from its original. My body is the same, and I need not lay it aside. I find that place with my body like a breeze finds odor, as water mixes with water, fire with water, and air with air. So does the spiritual body easily join with any material form that it likes. But a physical body cannot mix with a non-physical substance, nor can a solid rock become the same as the idea of a hill. Your body has its mental and spiritual parts. It has become physical because of its habitual tendency towards the physical. Your physical body becomes spiritual by leaning towards spirituality, as in your sleep, your protracted meditation, and your unconsciousness to fancies and reveries. Your spiritual nature will return to your body when your earthly desires are lessened and curbed within the mind. Leela said, "Say, goddess, what happens to the spiritual body after it has attained its compactness by constant practice of yoga? Does it become indestructible, or does it perish like all other finite bodies?" The goddess replied, "Anything that exists is perishable and, of course, liable to death. But how can something die that is nothing and is imperishable in its nature? Again, once we realize the mistake of thinking a rope to be a snake, the snake disappears of itself, and no one mistakes the rope any more. Thus, as the true knowledge of the rope removes the false conception of the snake in it, so the recognition of the spiritual body dispels the misconception of its materiality. All imagery is at an end when there is no image at all, just like the art of carving statues must cease if there is no more stone. We clearly see our bodies as full of the Spirit of God. Your gross understanding keeps you from seeing this. In the beginning, when consciousness, chit, is engrossed with the imagination of the mind, it loses sight of the One. Leela asked, but how can imagination trace out anything in that unity in which the division of time and space and all things are lost in an undistinguishable mass? The goddess replied, like the bracelet in gold, waves in water, the show of truth in dreams, and the appearance of castles in the sky, all vanish upon an accurate perception. So the imaginary attributes of the unpredictable God are all nothing whatever. Just like there is no dust in the sky, no attribute or partial property can be ascribed to God, whose nature is indivisible and unimaginable, and who is an unborn unity, tranquil and all-pervading. Whatever shines about us is the pure light of that being who scatters his luster all around like a transcendental gem. Leela said, if it is so at all times, then tell me, O goddess, how did we happen to fall into the error of attributing duality and diversity to his nature? The goddess replied, it was your ignorance that for so long has led you to err. The natural bane of mankind is the absence of reasoning, and it requires remedying by your attending to reason. When reason takes the place of ignorance, in a moment it introduces the light of knowledge in the soul instead of its former darkness. As reason advances, your ignorance and your bondage to prejudice are put to flight. Then you have an unobstructed liberation and pure understanding in this world. As long as you remained without reasoning on the subject, you were either sleeping or wandering in error. Now your reason and liberation are awakened, and the seeds for the suppression of your desire are sown in your heart. At first the nature of this physical world was neither apparent to you, nor you to it. How long will you reside in it, and what other desires have you here? Withdraw your mind from its thoughts of the viewer, the visible, and the vision of this world. Settle your mind on the idea of the entire negation of all existence. Fix your meditation solely upon the Supreme Being, and sit in a state of unalterable unconsciousness. When the seed of renunciation has taken root and germinated in your heart, the sprouts of your likes and dislikes will be destroyed of themselves. Then the impression of the world will be utterly effaced from the mind, and an unshaken anesthesia will overtake you all at once. Remaining entranced in your abstract meditation, in process of time, you will have a soul as luminous as a star in the clear sky of heaven, free from the links of all causes and their effects forevermore. Book 3, Chapter 22, Practice of Wisdom, Vijnana Bhyasa. The goddess continued, objects seen in a dream prove to be false on being awakened. Similarly, belief in the reality of the body becomes unfounded upon dissolution of our desires. As a thing dreamt of disappears upon waking, so does the waking body disappear in sleep when desires lie dormant in the soul. As our physical bodies awake after dreaming and desiring, so our spiritual bodies awake after we cease to think of our physical states. In deep sleep we are devoid of desires. Similarly, in the state of renunciation, even though we are awake in our physical bodies, we have the tranquility of liberation. The desire of men liberated while living, the jivan mukta, is not properly any desire at all. It is a pure desire relating to universal well-being and happiness. The sleep in which the will and wish are dormant is called deep sleep, but the dormancy of desire in the waking state is known as unconsciousness to delusion, moha, or unconsciousness, murcha. Again, the deep sleep that is wholly devoid of desire is called the turaya, or the fourth stage of yoga. In the waking state, it is called samadhi, or union with Supreme. The embodied man, whose life is freed from all desires in this world, is called the liberated while living, the jivan mukta, a state unknown to those who are not liberated. When the mind becomes a pure essence, as in samadhi, and its desires are weakened, it becomes spiritualized, and it glows and flows like snow melts to water by application of heat. The spiritualized mind, being awakened, mixes with the holy spirits of departed souls in the other world. When your sense of individual ego is moderated by your practice of meditation, then the perception of invisible will rise of itself clearly before your mind. When spiritual knowledge gains a firm footing in your mind, you will perceive more other worlds than you expect. Therefore, O blameless lady, try your utmost to deaden your desires. When you have gained sufficient strength in that practice, know yourself to be liberated in this life. When the moon of your intellectual knowledge shines fully with its cooling beams, you shall have to leave your physical body here in order to see the other worlds. Your fleshly body has no tangible connection with that one that is without flesh, nor can the intellectual body perform any action on the physical system. I have told you all this according to my best knowledge and the state of things as they are. Even children know that what I say is as effective as the curse or blessing of a god. The habitual reliance of men upon their gross bodies and their fond attachment to them bind their souls down to the earth. The weakening of earthly desires serves to clothe them with spiritual bodies. Nobody believes that he has a spiritual body, even at his deathbed, but everyone thinks a dying man is dead with his body forever. This body, however, neither dies nor is it alive at any time. Both life and death in all respects are mere appearances of aerial dreams and desires. The life and death of beings here below are as false as the appearance and disappearance of people in imagination, or dolls in play of puppet show. Leela said, O Goddess, the pure knowledge that you have given me has fallen on my ears, acts like a healing balm to the pain caused by phenomena. Now tell me the name and nature of the practice for spiritualization. How is it to be perfected, and what is the end of such perfection? The goddess replied, Whatever a man attempts to do here at any time, he can hardly ever complete it without painful practice to the utmost of his power. The wise say that practice consists in the association of one thing with another, in understanding it thoroughly, and in devoting oneself solely to his object. Great souls become successful in this world who are disgusted with the world and are moderate in their enjoyment and desires. They do not think about seeking what they lack. These great minds are said to be best trained who are graced with liberal views, are delighted with the relish of unconcern with the world, and are enraptured with streams of heavenly joy. Again they are called the best practiced in divine knowledge, who by the light of reasoning and Scripture are employed preaching the absolute non-existence of any distinction between the knower and what is known in this world. What some call practical knowledge is knowing that nothing was produced in the beginning, and nothing that is visible, such as this world or oneself, is true at any time. The effect of practicing meditation is a strong tendency of the soul towards the Spirit of God, which results from an understanding of the non-existence of the visible world and the subsistence of passion. But mere knowledge of the non-existence of the world without subduing passion is known as knowledge without practice, and is of no value to its possessor. Consciousness of the non-existence of the visible world is the true knowledge of the knowable. The practice of meditation makes this knowledge a habit in the mind and leads one to his final extinction, nirvana. The practice of meditation prepares the mind and awakens the intelligence which lay dormant in the dark night of this world. Consciousness then sheds its cooling showers of reason like dewdrops in the frosty night of autumn. Valmiki speaking. As the sage was lecturing in this manner, the day departed for its evening service, and led the assembled train to their evening prayers. After the rising beams of the sun dispelled the darkness of night, they met again with mutual greeting. Book 3, Chapter 23. Saraswati and Leela meditated and began astral travel. Vasistha said, after their conversation between Goddess Saraswati and the excellent Leela on that night, the two of them found Leela's family and attendants fast asleep in their inner apartment. Saraswati and Leela entered the shrine that was closely shut on all sides by latches fastened to the doors and windows, and which was perfumed with the fragrance of heaps of flowers. They sat beside the corpse decorated with fresh flowers and garment. Their faces shone like the fair full moon and brightened the place. They stood motionless on the spot, as if they were sculptures engraved on marble columns or pictures drawn upon the wall. They shook off all their thoughts and cares, and became as withdrawn as the faded blossoms of the lotus at the end of the day, when their fragrances fled. They remained still, calm and quiet, without any motion of their limbs, like a sheet of clouds hanging on a mountain-top in the calm of autumn. They continued in fixed attention without any external sensation, like some lonely vine shriveled for lack of moisture in samadhi meditation. They were fully impressed with a disbelief of their own existence, and that of all other things in the world. They were completely absorbed in the thought of an absolute privation of everything at large. They lost memory of the phantom of the phenomenal world, which is as unreal as the horn of a hare. What had no existence in the beginning is still non-existent at present, and what appears existent is as non-existent as water in a mirage. The two ladies became as quiet as inert nature itself, and as still as the sky before the stars rolled about in its ample sphere. Then they began to move with their own bodies, the goddess of wisdom in her form of intelligence, and the queen in her intellectual and meditative mood. With their new bodies they rose as high as the width of a hand above the ground. Then, taking the forms of empty consciousness, they began to rise in the sky. Then the two ladies, their playful open eyes, and by their nature of intellectual knowledge, ascended to the higher region of the sky. They flew higher and higher by force of their intellect, and arrived at a region stretching millions of miles in length. The pair in their ethereal forms looked around according to their nature in search of some visible objects, but finding no other figure except their own, they became much more attached to each other by their mutual affection. Book 3, Chapter 24, Description of the Astral Journey. Vasistha continued, thus ascending higher and higher, and by degrees reaching the highest station, they continued viewing the heavens with their hands clasped together. They saw a vast expanse like a wide extended universal ocean, deep and translucent within, but soft with ethereal mildness. A cooling breeze infused heavenly delight. They dived into the vast ocean of emptiness, all delightful and pleasant. It gave them delight far greater in its purity than what is derived from the company of the virtuous. They wandered about all sides of heaven under the beams of the full moon shining above them. They lingered under the clear vault of clouds covering the mountain tops of Meru, as if under the dome of a huge whitewashed building. They roved by the regions of spiritual masters and male nature spirits. They breathed the charming fragrance of mandara garlands, and passing the lunar sphere, they inhaled the sweet scent exhaled by the breeze from that nectar-like lunar orb. Tired and perspiring profusely, they bathed in the lakes of showering clouds filled with the blushing lotuses of lurid lightning flashes within them. They freely strode at random on all sides, and lighted on the tops of high mountains like fluttering bees, appearing like filaments of the lotus-like earth below. They also roved under the vaults of some cloud fragments scattered by the winds, and raining like the cascade of the Ganges River, thinking them as a shower bathhouse in the air. Then, failing in their strength, they paused in many places with slow and slackened steps. They saw emptiness full of great and wonderful works. They saw what they had never seen before, the tremendous depth of the void that was not filled up by the myriads of worlds which keep revolving in it. Over and higher, they saw the celestial spheres filled with luminous orbs adorned with their ornamental stars, wandering one above and around the other. Huge mountainous bodies, like Mount Meru, moved about in empty space and emitted a reddish glare on all sides, like the flame of fire from within their bowels. There were beautiful tablelands, like those of the Himalayas, with their pearly peaks of snow. There were mountains of gold spreading a golden color over the land. In one place they saw mountains of emerald, tinting the landscape with a lush green like a field of fresh grass. In other places they saw some dark cloud dimming the sight of the spectator and hiding the spectacle in dark blackness. They saw also tracts of blue sapphire with vines of parjita flowers blooming like banners in the blue sky. They saw the minds of spiritual masters, the Siddhas, in flight faster than the swift wind. They heard the vocal music of the songs of heavenly nymphs in their aerial abodes. All the great bodies in the universe, the planetary system, were in continual motion. Spirits of the gods and demigods moved about unseen by one another. Groups of spiritual beings, the Kushmandas, Rakshasas, and Pishakas, were seated in aerial circles at the borders. Winds and gales blew with full force in their ethereal course. In some places they heard clouds roaring loudly like the rumbling wheels of heavenly cars, and the noise of rapid stars resembled the blowing of pneumatic engines. Half-burnt masters, having flown too close to the sun, were flying from their burning cars under the solar rays. Solar embers were flung afar by the breath of the nostril of their horses. In some places they saw the rulers of men and lines of female nature spirits, apsaras, hurrying up and down in the air. In others they saw goddesses wandering amidst the smoky and fiery clouds in the firmament. Here they saw some sparks of light falling like the jewels of celestial nymphs in their hurried flight to their respective spheres. There they saw the light spirits of lesser masters dwindling into darkness. Flakes of mist were falling off from the clouds, as if by friction from the bodies of turbulent spirits rushing up and down the skies, and shrouded mountainsides like sheets of cloth. Groups of cloud fragments were flying about in the air in the shapes of crows, owls, and vultures. They saw some monsters also, such as dakinis, heaving their heads in the form of huge surges in the cloudy ocean of the sky. They were the bodies of yoginis, too, their faces resembling those of dogs, ravens, asses, and camels, who were traversing the wide expanse of the heavens to no purpose. There were masters and nature spirits sporting in pairs in the dark, smoky and ash-colored clouds that spread the four quarters of the sky. They saw the path of the planets, the zodiac, resounding loudly with the heavenly music of the spheres. They also saw the path of the lunar mansions that constantly marked the course of the 2 fortnights. They saw the sons of God moving about in the air, and they viewed with wonders the celestial Ganges, the Milky Way, studded with stars and rolling with the speed of wind. They saw gods wielding the thunderbolts, discus, trident, swords, and missiles. They heard Narada and Tumbura singing in their aerial abodes on high. They saw the region of the clouds, where there were huge bodies of clouds, mute as painting, and pouring forth floods of rain as in the great deluge. In one place they saw a dark cloud as high as the mountain king Himalaya, slowly moving in the air, and in others clouds of a golden color like the setting sun. In one place there were flimsy sheets of clouds, as are said to hover the peaks of the Rishaya range, and at another a cloud like the calm blue bed of the sea. Tufts of grass were seen in some places as if blown up by winds and floating in the stream of air. In other places swarms of butterflies with glossy coats and wings were seen. In some places there was a cloud of dust raised by wind appeasing like a lake at the top of a mountain. The matras were seen in one place, dancing naked in giddy circles, and in another great yoginis sat forever giddy with intoxication. In one place there were circles of holy men sitting in their calm meditation, and in others pious saints who had cast away their worldly cares. There was a conclave of celestial singers composed of heavenly nymphs, Kanaras and Gandharvas in one place, and some quiet towns and cities situated at others. There were the cities of Brahma and Rudra full with their people, and the city of illusion, Maya, with its increasing population. There were crystal lakes in some places and stagnant pools at others, and lakes with masters seated by them and others hugged by the rising moon. They saw the sun rising in one part and the darkness of night veiling the other, the evening casting its shadow on one and the dusky mist of dusk obscuring the other. There were hoary clouds of winter in some places and those of rain in others. Somewhere they appeared as tracts of land, at another as a sheet of water. Bodies of gods and demigods wandered from one side to the other, some from east to west, and other from north to south. There were mountains heaving their heads thousands of miles high, and there were valleys and caves covered in eternal darkness. In one place there was a vast, inextinguishable fire, like that of the blazing sun, and in another a thick frost covering the moonlight. Somewhere there was a great city flourishing with groves and trees, and in another big temples of gods leveled to the ground by the might of demons. In some places there was a streak of light from a falling meteor in the sky, in another the blaze of a comet with its 1,000 fiery tails in the air. In one place there was a lucky planet rising in view with its full orb, in another there spread the gloom of night, and full sunshine in another. Here the clouds were roaring, and they were dumb and mute. Here were the high blasts driving the clouds in air, and then the gentle breeze dropping clusters of flowers on the ground. Sometimes the sky was clear and fair without a cloud in it, as transparent as the soul of a wise man delighted with the knowledge of truth. The empty region of the celestial gods was so full with the dewy beams of the silvery moon that it appeared like a shower of rain and raised the loud croaking of the frogs below. Flocks of peacocks and goldfinches fluttering about in one place, and vehicles of the goddesses and celestial girls thronged in another. A number of the peacocks of Kartiya were seen dancing amidst the clouds, and a flight of greenish parrots were seen in the sky appearing as a green plain. Dwarfish clouds were moving like a stout buffalo of Yama, and others in the form of horses were grazing on the grassy meadows of clouds. Cities of the gods and demons appeared with their towers on high. Distinct towns and hills were seen separated by distances, as if detached from one another by driving winds. In some place gigantic Bhairavas were dancing with their mountain body, and at another great Garudas were flying like winged mountains in the air. Huge mountains were tossed about by the blowing of winds, and the castles of the nature spirits were rising and falling with the celestial nymphs in them. There were some clouds rising on high, and some appearing like rolling mountains in the sky that were crushing force below. In one place the sky appeared like a clear lake abounding in lotuses. Moonbeams shone brightly in one spot, and sweet, cooling breezes blew softly in another. Hot, sultry winds were blowing in some place, singeing the forest on mountainous clouds. There was a dead silence in one spot, caused by perfect calmness of the breeze, while another spot presented a scene of 100 peaks rising on a mountain-like cloud. In one place, raining clouds roared loudly in their fury, and in another a furious battle was waging in the clouds between the gods and demons. In some place geese were seen gabbling in the lotus lake of the sky, inviting the ganders by their loud crackling cries. Forms of fishes, crocodiles, and alligators were seen flying in the air, as if they had been transformed into aerial beings by the holy waters of the Ganges of their birth. Somewhere, as the sun went down the horizon, they saw the dark shadow of the earth eclipse the moon. When they saw the shadow of the moon eclipse the sun, they saw a magical flower garden, exhaling its fragrance in the air, and strewing the flower of heaven with a profusion of flowers scattered by showers of morning dew. They saw all beings contained in three worlds flying in the air, like a swarm of gnats in the hollow of a fig tree. Then the two excellent ladies stopped their astral journey, intent upon revisiting the earth. Book 3, Chapter 25. Description of astral travel over the earth. Vasistha speaking. Then these ladies in their forms of intelligence alighted from the sky, and passing over the mountainous regions, saw the houses of men on the surface of the earth. They saw the world appearing like a lotus in the heart of Nara, the primeval man or eternal spirit pervading the universe. Its 8 sides form the flower petals, the hill its pistils, and the center contains its sweet flavor. The rivers are the tubes of its filaments, covered with drops of snow resembling their pollen. Days and nights roll over it like swarms of black bees and butterflies, and all its living beings appear like gnats fluttering about. Its long stalks, white as bright daylight, are composed of fibers serving for food, and of tubes conducting the drink to living beings. It is wet with moisture, sucked by the sun. Resembling a swan swimming about in the air, in the darkness of night and absence of the sun it folds itself in sleep. The earth, like a lotus, is situated on the surface of the waters of the ocean. At times the motion of the ocean makes the earth shake, causing earthquakes. The earth rests upon the serpent Sesha as its support, and is girt upon by demons as its thorns and prickles. Mount Meru and other mountains are its large seeds. They are great hives of human population, where the fair daughters of the giant race embraced with the sons of God and created the race of men. It has the extensive continent of Asia situated in one pearl, its veins forming its division, and the tubular filaments its rivers. The 7 elevated mountains forming the boundary lines of this continent are its seeds, and in its middle the great Mount Samuru reaches the sky. Its lakes are like dewdrops on a lotus leaf, and its forests are like the flower's pollen. The people inhabiting the land all around are like swarm of bees. Its extent is 1,000 leagues square, and is surrounded on all sides by the dark sea like a belt of black bees. It contains 9 divisions, ruled by 9 brother kings, resembling the regions of its 8 petal sides, with the Bharata, India, in the midst. It stretches 1,000,000 miles with more land than water. Its habitable parts are as thick as frozen ice in winter. The continent is surrounded by the briny ocean twice as large, like a bracelet encircles the wrist. Beyond it lies the circular form of Sakha continent, twice the size of Jamvitha, and also encircled by the sea. This called the Milky Ocean because of the sweetness of its water, and it is double the size of the former salt sea. Beyond that, and double the size, is Kujdawipta continent, full of population. It is also circular and surrounded by another sea, the belt of the Sea of Curds, delectable to the gods, and double the size of the continent it encircles. After that lies the circle of Karancha continent, also twice the size of the former one, and surrounded by a sea like a canal surrounds a city. The sea is called the Sea of Butter, and is twice as large as the continent it surrounds. Beyond it lies Salmali continent, surrounded by the foul Sea of Wine. The fair belt of the sea resembles a wreath of white flowers, like the girdle of the Sisha serpent, forming the necklace hanging on the breast of Vishnu. Thereafter stretches Plaksa continent, double the size of the former, and surrounded by the belt of the Sea of Sugar that appears like the snowy plains of the Himalaya. After that lies the belt of Pushkara continent, twice as large as the preceding one, and encircled by a sea of sweet water double its circumference. There, at the distance of 10 degrees, they saw the belt of the South Polar Circle, with its hideous cave below that ascent to the infernal regions. The way to the infernal cave is full of danger and fear, and 10 times in length from the circle of the continents. The cave is surrounded on all sides by a dreadful emptiness, and below it is half covered by a thick gloom, as if a blue lotus were attached to it. There stood Loka Sumera, or South Polar Mountain, which is bright with sunshine on one side and covered by darkness on the other, studded with various gems on its peak, and decked with flowers growing upon it. It reflected the glory of the 3 worlds situated on its peak, like a cap of hairs. At a great distance from it is a great forest that is not trodden by the feet of any living being. Then, proceeding upward, they saw the great northern ocean encompassing the pole on all sides. Further on, they saw the flaming light of the aurora borealis, which threatened to melt the snowy mountains to water. Proceeding onward, they met with the fierce north wind, blowing with all their fury and force. They threatened to uproot the mountains as if they were dust or grass. They traversed the empty vacuum with their noiseless motion. Far away they saw the empty space of vacuum stretching wide all about them. It spreads unlimited and encompasses the worlds like a golden bracelet encircles the wrist. Thus Leela, having seen the seas and mountains, the rulers of the world, the city of the gods, the sky above and the earth below, in the unlimited vault of the universe, suddenly returned to her own land and found herself in her room again. Book 3, Chapter 26. Return to the holy Brahman's house. Description of gloom. Vasistha explains astral appearance. Vasistha said, after the excellent ladies had returned from their visit of physical sphere, they entered the house where the holy Brahman used to live. There the holy ladies, unseen by anyone, saw the tomb of the Brahman. The maid-servants were dejected with sorrow, and the faces of the women were soiled with tears, faded like lotuses with their withered leaves. All joy had fled from the house, leaving it like the dry bed of Dead Sea after its waters were sucked. It was like a garden parched in summer, or a tree struck by lightning. It was as joyless as a dried lotus torn by a blast or withering under frost, and as faint as the light of a lamp without its wick or oil, and as dim as the eyeball without its light. The house without its master was as sad as the face of a dying person, or like a forest with its falling and withered leaves, or like dry and dusty ground for lack of rain. Then Leela, with her gracefulness of divine knowledge, the elegance of her perfection, and her devotion for truth, thought within herself that the residents of the house might see her and the goddess in their ordinary forms as human beings. Then the people of the house saw the two ladies as Lakshmi and Gauri, brightening the house with the light of their being. Wreaths of unfading flowers of various kinds adorned the two women from head to foot. They seemed like the personification of spring season, perfuming the house with the fragrance of a flower garden. They appeared to rise like a pair of moons with their cooling and pleasant beams infusing a freshness to the family, like moonlight does to medical plants in forests and villages. The soft glances of their eyes under the long, loose and pendant curls of their hair were like a shower of white malati flowers from the dark, cloudy spots of their black-lined eyes. Their bodies were as bright as melted gold and as vibrant as a flowing stream. Their brilliance cast a golden color on the spot where they stood, as it did over the forest all around. The natural beauty of Lakshmi's body and the trembling glare of Leela's body spread as it were a sea of radiance about them, in which their bodies seemed to move like undulating waves. Their relaxed arms resembling loose vines, their palms like red leaflets, shook like the fresh kalpa vines in the forest. They touched the ground with their feet that resembled the fresh and tender petals of a flower, or like lotuses growing upon the ground. Their appearance seemed to sprinkle ambrosial dew all around and made the dry withered and brown branches of the tamara tree sprout new tender leaflets. On seeing them, the whole family, with Sarma, the eldest son of the deceased Brahman, cried aloud and said, "Hail to the woodland goddesses," and threw handfuls of flowers at their feet. The flower offerings that fell on their feet resembled showers of dewdrops falling on lotus leaves in a lake of lotuses. Sarma said, "Hail, you goddesses who have come here to dispel our sorrow. It is inborn in the nature of good people to deliver others from their distress." The goddesses addressed him gently. "Tell us the cause of your sorrow, which has made you all so sad." Then one by one, Sarma and others described their sorrow owing to the death of the Brahman couple. They said, "Know, O goddess pair, there lived here a Brahman and his wife who had been the support of guests and a model for Brahmins. They were our parents who recently died. They have abandoned us, leaving all their friends and domestic animals here. They have departed to heaven and left us quite helpless in the world." The birds sitting on the top of the house have been continually pouring their pious and mournful sounds over the bodies of the deceased. Mountains on all sides have been lamenting their loss with the hoarse noise of winds howling in their caverns, shedding showers of tears in the course of the streams issuing from their side. Clouds have poured their tears in floods of rainwater, then fled from the skies. The heavenly quarters have been sending their sighs in sultry winds all around. The poor village people are wailing in piteous tones, their bodies disheveled from rolling upon the ground. They are trying to yield up their lives with continued fasting. The trees are shedding their tears every day in drops of melting snow, exuding from the cells of their leaves and flowers, resembling the sockets of their eyes. The streets are deserted for lack of passers-by, and have become dusty without being watered. They have become as empty as the hearts of men forsaken by their joys of life. Among the sad notes of cuckoos and the humming of bees, fading plants are wailing and withering from the sultry sighs of their inner grief. Snows are melting from the heat of their grief, their waters falling in cataracts that break into 100 channels as they fall upon stony basins. Our prosperity has fled from us, and we sit here in dumb despair of hope. Our houses have become dark and gloomy as a desert. Here the humble bees are humming in grief upon the scattered flowers in our garden that now sends forth a putrid smell instead of their former fragrance. The vines that twine so gaily round the spring trees are dwindling and dying away with their closing and fading flowers. The rivulets, with their loose and low rippling murmur, and the light wave-like motion of their liquid bodies on the ground, are running hurriedly in their sorrow to cast themselves into the sea. Despite the disturbance of the gnats flying constantly upon them, ponds are as still in their sorrow as men sitting in their meditation. Truly this day the presence of our parents is adorning that part of heaven where heavenly singers, the Kanaras, Gandharvas, and Vidharas, welcome them with their music. Therefore, O Devis, reduce our excessive grief, because the visit of the great never goes for nothing. Hearing these words, Leela gently touched the head of her son with her hand, as the lotus bed leans to touch its offshoot by the stalk. At her touch, the boy was relieved of all his sorrow and misfortune, just like the summer heat of the mountain is reduced by the showers of rainy season. All others in the house were as highly gratified at the sight of the goddesses as when a pauper is relieved of his poverty or the sick are healed by a draught of nectar. Rama said, "Remove my doubt, sage. Why didn't Leela appear in her own form of Arundhati before her eldest son, Sarma?" Vasistha answered, "You forget, O Rama, and think that Leela had a material body or could assume one at pleasure. She was in an astral form, her form of pure intellect, and it was with her spiritual hand that she touched the inner spirit of the boy and not his material body. Belief in materialism leads one to think that this unreal earthly frame is real, just like a boy's belief in ghosts makes him take a shadow for a spirit. But this belief in one's materiality is soon over upon conviction of one's spirituality, just like the traces of our vision in a dream are removed on a knowledge of their unreality upon waking. Belief that matter is an empty nothing leads to the knowledge of the spirit. A glass door appears as open space to someone of an irritable temperament. In the same way, matter appears as nothing to the wise. A dream presents the sights of cities, lands, air, and water where there are no such things in actuality. A dream causes the movements of our limbs and bodies for no purpose. As air appears as earth in dreaming, so the non-existent world appears to exist in waking. It is thus that men see and talk of things unseen and unknown in their fits of delirium. Children see ghosts in the air, and of dying men sees a forest in it. Others see elephants in clouds, and some see pearls and sunbeams. Those who are panic-struck and deranged in their minds, and half-waking and passengers in vessels, see many appearances like such ghosts in force and betray what they see in dreams by the movements of their bodies. In this manner everyone is of the form of whatever he thinks himself to be. It is only habit that makes him to believe himself as such. He is not so in reality. But Leela, who had known the truth of the non-existence of the world, was conscious of its nothingness and viewed all things as false conception of the mind. Thus he who sees only Brahma filling the sphere of his consciousness has no room for a son or friend or wife. He who views the whole as filled with the spirit of Brahma, with nothing produced in it, has no room for affection or hatred for anything in it. The hand that Leela laid on the head of Sarma, her eldest son, was not lain from her material affection for him, but for his edification in intellectual knowledge. Consciousness being awakened, there is all joy attendant upon it. It is more subtle than ether and far purer than vacuum, and leads the intellectual being above the region of air. All other things are like images in a dream. Book 3, Chapter 27. Leela remembers her past lives. Vasistha speaking. Then the two ladies disappeared from that place, leaving the Brahmin family in their house in the mountainous village. The family exclaimed, "We are highly favored by the woodland goddesses." Then, forgetting their grief, they returned to their domestic employment. Then the ethereal goddesses spoke to the aerial Leela, who stood fixed in the air over the Brahmin's house in a state of mute astonishment. They conversed with each other as familiarly as persons having the same thoughts and desires agree with each other in their views and acts, and as the dreamers of the same dream hold their mutual correspondence, like Usha and Aniruddha. Their conversation in the immaterial form was one of the same intellectual kind as we are conscious of in our dreams and imagination. Saraswati said, "Now you have fully known the knowable, and you have become acquainted with whatever is visible and invisible. Such is the essence of Brahma. Say now, what more do you want to know?" Leela said, "Tell me the reason why I was seen by my son, but wasn't seen where the spirit of my deserted lord is reigning over his realm." Saraswati replied, "Because then you were not perfect by your practice of meditation to have your wish fulfilled, nor had you lost your sense of duality which prevents perfection. He who has not known unity is not entitled to the acts and benefits of faith in the true God, as no one sitting in the sun can enjoy the coolness of shade. You were not practiced to forget your identity as Leela, nor had you learned that it is not your will but the will of God that is always fulfilled. Later you become pure desire and wish that your son might see you, whereby he was able to see you. If you should return now to your husband and do the same, you will undoubtedly be successful in your desire." Leela said, "I see within the sphere of this dome of my mind that the holy Brahman has been my husband before. I also see that after he died, he became a ruler of the earth. In my mind I see the spot of the earth, that city and his palace where I sat as queen. Within myself I see my lord reigning in that place, and I can even see how he died afterwards. I see the glory of the ruler of so many countries on earth, and I also see the perfect frankness of his conduct throughout his life. In the inner sky of my mind I see the worlds as they were placed in a casket, just like oil is contained within a mustard seed. I see the bright orb of my husband ever wandering before me, and now I pray you to contrive some way to place me by his side." The goddess replied, "Tell me, Leela, to which husband should you go? You have had and will have hundreds of them in your past and future lives, and now there are 3 of them confined in this earth. The nearest of the 3 is the Brahmin here, who is reduced to ashes. The next is the king lying in state and covered with flowers in the inner apartment. The 3rd is now a reigning king on this earth, and has been buffeting in the waves of error in the vast ocean of the world. His intellect is darkened and distorted by the splashing waves of worldliness. His intelligence is perverted to stupidity. He is converted to a tortoise in the ocean of the world. The management of his very many disordered state affairs has stultified him into a clumsy lout, and he is now fast asleep amidst the turmoil of business. The strong chain of his thoughts has bound him to think that he is a lord, mighty and accomplished, and that he is happy and can enjoy his estates forever. Now say, O excellent lady, to what husband do you wish to be led, like the fragrance of one forest carried by the breeze to another? Here you are in one place, and they are in others in this vast universe. The states of their lives and manners differ widely from one another. These orbs of light in the heaven, though they appear to be placed so near to us, are situated millions of leagues apart from one another, and they carry the departed souls. All these bodies are as empty as air, though they contain the great mountain Meru and Mandara in themselves. All bodies are formed by a combination of atoms constantly proceeding from the great intellect, like particles of sunbeams over the universe. The great and stupendous fabric of the world is no more than a quantity of paddy rice weighed in a balance. As the spangled heavens appear like a forest full of brilliant gems, so the world appears to the contemplative mind as full of the glory of God, and not composed of earth or any of the material bodies. In the intelligent soul, it is consciousness alone that shines in the form of world, and not any material body that was never brought into being. Like waves in a lake rise and set and rise again, so the rising and falling days and nights present these various scenes to our knowledge. Leela said, "So it is, O mother of mankind. I come to remember now that my present birth is of a royal kind, neither too pure nor gross in nature. I, having descended from Brahma, have undergone 108 births, and after passing various states, I find myself still in existence. I recollect, O goddess, that I was born in another world, that I was a bride of a demigod, and used to wander about as freely as a bee over flowers. Being debased by my lack of moral restraint, I was born in this mortal world, and became the mate of the king of the eagle-feathered tribe. Having lived in the woods, then I was turned into a woodsman's mate, wearing a garment of leaves on my loin. Growing fond of my life, I played wantonly about the forest and was changed into a golunka plant, delighting the woods with my leafy palms and flowering eyes. This small tree in a holy hermitage was held sacred by a group of saintly sages. Then after the woods were burnt down by a wildfire, I was regenerated into the form of a hermit's child. Here I was taught the formulas for removing the curse of womanhood, and I became a male in the person of a handsome prince of the land of Shrestha, Surat, where I reigned for 100 years. Then, on account of my misconduct in the government, I was denounced to become a weasel covered with leprosy, living in the lowlands of Tali. I remember, O goddess, how I became a bullock in Surat, and how for full 8 years I was goaded by thoughtless cowherd children in their merry sport. I have in mind that when I was transformed into a bird, with what difficulty I broke the net that was laid by bird-catchers for my destruction. It was in the same manner as we release ourselves from the snare of sinful desire. I remember with pleasure when as a bee I landed lightly on the leaflets of blossoms, sipped the honey of the blooming buds, dined on the pistils, and slept in the cups of lotus flowers. In the form of an antelope I wandered about in pleasant woodlands and lawns with my exalted and branching horns and beautiful eyes, until I was killed by a hunter's arrow. I have been in the form of a fish, and I was lifted up by the waves of the sea above the surface of the water. I saw how a tortoise was killed by the blow of a club on the neck. I was a tribal, outcast hunter once, wandering by the side of the Chamvanti River. When tired of roaming, I used to quench my thirst with coconut water. I also became a stork, delighting in the lakes with my mate, filling the air with our sweet cries. In another birth I rambled about in groves of palm and tamara trees, and fixed my eyes with amorous looks and glanced upon my lover. Next I was a fairy, Apsara, with a form as bright as melted gold, and features as beautiful as those of a lotus and lily, in which the celestials used to take delight like bees and butterflies. I remember being on earth, having decked myself in gold, pearls, rubies, and other gems, and playing with my youthful consorts in pleasure gardens and groves, and in all hills and mountains. I also remember living long as a tortoise on the borders of a river, and to have been carried away by the waves, sometimes under a tree of vines overhung with clusters of beautiful flowers, sometimes washed by waves into some wild cave. I see how I acted the part of a goose covered by feathers, swimming on the high heaving waves of the surface of the lake. Then, seeing a poor gnat hanging on the moving leaf of a cotton tree, I became its associate, and as contemptible a thing as itself. I became an aquatic crane also, skimming playfully over waters gushing from hills, slightly kissing the crest of waves rising over the rapid torrent. I remember also how I slighted the loves of amorous youth and spurned the lesser demigod children on the Ganda Mandana and the Mandara hills. I remember likewise the pangs of lovelorn lass, as I lay pining in my bed strewn with the fragrance of camphor, and how I was decaying like the disk of the waning moon. Thus I passed through many births in the wombs of higher and lower animals, and found them all to be full of pain. My soul has run over the waves of the irresistible current of life, like a fleet antelope pacing its speed with the swiftness of the wind. Book 3, Chapter 28. Leela's Vision and Meditation. Description of the mountain hamlet. Rama said, "Tell me, sage, how did the goddesses break out of the strongholds of their bodies and the prison house of this world and pass through infinite space and survey the scenes beyond its confines?" Vasistha replied, "Where is the world, and where is its support of solidity?" They were all situated in the region within the minds of the goddesses. In their minds they saw the hilly track where the Brahmin Vasistha lived and had his desire for royalty. They saw his deserted house, and in their minds they saw the surface of the earth stretching to the seas. In that imaginary spot on earth they saw the city of the king and the royal palace which he had enjoyed with Arundhati his wife. They saw how she was born under the name of Leela, and how she worshipped the goddess of wisdom, Saraswati, by whom she was miraculously conveyed to a delightful region of the sky. It was in the house situated in that hilly village that she saw the world placed within the space of her mind. Having come out of her vision of the world, she found herself sitting in her house, just like one finds himself lying in his own bed after rambling from one dream to another. All that she saw was mere vision and void. There was no world, no earth, no house, and no distance. It was the mind that showed them these images, just like the mind presents the objects of our desire to our view. Otherwise there is neither world nor earth in actuality. The sphere of consciousness is infinite and without any covering. If agitated by the power of one's intellect, it presents all the objects of nature to his view, like the sky when agitated by heat produces the winds. The sphere of consciousness is uncreated. It is ever calm everywhere. Deluded minds suppose the world to exist. He who understands rightly sees the world is as unsubstantial as air, but whoever is misled by wrong judgment takes it to be like a solid mountain. As a house and city are manifested to us in our dreams, so this unreal world is presented as a reality to our understanding. It is like the misconception of water in the mirage, and the mistake of gold in a bracelet. All this unreality appears as a reality to the mistaken mind. Discoursing in this manner between themselves, the two charming ladies walked out of the house with their graceful steps. Being unseen by the village people, they viewed the mountain standing before them, kissing the vault of heaven and touching the orb of the sun with its lofty peak. It was decorated with flowers of various colors, and covered with a variety of trees of various colors. There were waterfalls gushing with their tremendous roaring on one side, and groves resounding with the warbling of birds in another. The clouds were variegated by many colored clusters of flowers sweeping over them, and cranes and storks sat screeching on the cloud-capped tops of galunka trees. There were robust reeds lining the banks of rivers with their wide-stretching stems and roots. Strong winds tossed the tender vines growing out of the rocky caves. Clouds from the vault of heaven hung over the tops of trees, covered with flowers, and shed their pearly drops of rainwater profusely upon them, forming streams below. The banks of the streamlets were continually lapped by waves raised by winds playing upon the shaking trees. Branches spread a cooling shade all around. Standing on that spot, the lady saw the hilly hamlet in the grass, like a fragment of heaven had fallen on the ground. There the rippling stream softly glided by, and here the brimming brooks wobbled in the ground. The birds of the air chirped on the sprays, and aquatic fowls flew about the holes of the seashore. There they saw herds of cattle slowly moving and grazing in the plains, filling the echoing woods with their loud lowing. They saw an open space broken with shady groves and trees, and green meadows all about. The cliffs were white with snow, impenetrable by sunbeams. Hilltops were covered with bushy brambles, forming like braids of hair upon their craggy heads. Cascades falling in torrents in the cavities of the rocks, scattering their pearly particles afar like the churning of the milky ocean by Mandara Mountain. The trees in the glens, loaded as they were with their fruit and flowers, appeared like waiters upon the goddesses, standing to welcome their approach with their rich presence. Shaken by gusts of roaring winds, the forest trees were shedding showers of their honey-sweetened flowers as offsprings to the woodland gods and people. The birds that approached fearlessly to drink the water, dropping from the hill, now fled for fear because the water seemed like sleet, or the shells and shots of archers. Birds, parched by thirst and wishing to drink the water, dashed by the waves of the rivulets, hovered upon it like stars in the sky. There were rows of crows sitting on the tops of tall palm trees, from whose sight children were hiding the remains of their sweetmeat. They saw country lads with garlands of flowers on their heads and garments rosing in the cooling shades of the date, jam, and neem trees. They saw a lean and hungry beggar woman passing by slowly, clad in cloth of flax with garlands of blossoms over her ears. They saw lazy rustics lying in their lonely retreats, talking away from the noisy brooks where they could hardly hear one another. They saw naked beggar children crowding in a compound, curd smeared on their face and hands, cow dung on their bodies, and holding flowery branches of plants in their hands. On the green river banks, waves shook bushes as they were a swing, leaving their marks on the sandy shore as the children receded to their bed. There was a house full of flies attracted by sweet milk and curds, but children were crying for lack of food. Herdsmen were fretting at seeing their bracelets daubed by cow dung they were spreading to dry. Men were smiling at seeing the eagerness of women tying the loose knots of their hair. Crows from the hilltops were alighting to pick up the offspring of the holy sages, and the paths around their houses were strewn with sacred kuru and kurunta leaves. Every morning, flowering plants growing in the caves of the hills and around the houses covered the ground hill-deep with heaps of flowers. They were whisk-tailed cattle and antelope grazing in one part of the forest, and tender young deer sleeping on beds of grass under gunja groves. There were young calves lying on their sides, shaking their ears to drive away the flies that fluttered around their faces, milk dripping from the sides of their mouth. Rooms stored honey collected by driving bees from their hives. Gardens were full of flowering asokas. Rooms were painted with red dye. Winds moistened by rain showers had brought the garden of trees to bloom, and yellow kadamba buds hung like a canopy over the beds of green grass below. The Kataka tree grove was blooming white with having its weeds removed, and the watercourse glided along with its soft murmuring tune. Winds whistled in the windows of caves, and clouds rested on mountain tops. Ponds were brimful of water covered with lotuses like so many moons. A grove of green trees cast its cooling and undivided shade upon the ground, where dewdrops trembled on blades of grass and glistened like twinkling stars in the blue sky. Trees constantly dropped their ripened fruit, dried flowers and leaves of various sorts, like showers of snow on whitened ground. Some clouds were seen to hang continually over the household compound, like aristocratic girls who never forsake their parents' home. Other clouds hovered over the roof of the house, flashing lightning to supply the light. The altar here reverberated to the loud roaring of the winds confined in the caves of the mountains. The temple there was graced by twittering swallows and parrots that perched upon it from their numerous flights. Soft breezes moved slowly as they passed along the lawn loaded with fragrance exhaled by sleepy flowers and gently shaking the leaves of trees. There the ladies listened to prattling and playful parrots and partridges, and here they heard the melodious notes of the kokilla nightingale calling back to the jarring crows in the branches. Palm and tamara trees were loaded with fruit, and the forest trees were entwined with vines that waved their leafy palms around them. There were tender ivy vines clasping the branches on one side, and the fragrance of efflorescens candala and salandra plants exhaled on the other. Tapering palm and tamara trees rose as high as spires, and a cooling breeze was flowing amidst the flower plants in the garden. There were cattle hastening to drink water in troughs, and garden trees hung with loads of green, unripe fruit and beautiful flowers. Running streams were hidden under rows of trees by their banks. Stalks of plants were studded with flowers. Gardens were perfumed with the nectar fragrance of kunda flowers, and lakes were redolent with the odor of lotuses hiding humble bees giddy with liquor in their honey cells. The air was reddened with rose-colored pollen flying from crimson lotuses, as if mocking the redness of Indra's palace in the sky. The scene was enchanted with the gurgling noise of small rivers running precipitously down from the hills, kunda flowers as white as clouds hanging over them, the beauty of the flower gardens around the house, and the musical warbling of songbirds singing joyfully in the air. Boys were sporting on beds of flowers, and plainful maidens were decked with flowering wreaths hanging down to their feet. Everywhere the ground was adorned with sprouting and prickly shrub and blades of grass. There was a beauty displayed in the collapsing of vines about the clumps of reeds. New shooting buds and blossoms covered the trees, and fragments of clouds shrouded the house below. The ground was decorated by wreaths of icicles, and the flashes of lightning in the clouds over the house terrified the women within. There was a sweet fragrance of blue lotuses, and the hoarse lowing of the cattle hurrying to their green grazing ground. Confident deer and does were lying tamely in the yard, and peacocks danced merrily before waterfalls as if they were showers of rainwater. Fragrant breezes were blowing giddily with the flavor of the fragrances they bore. Medicinal plants were lending their lights like lamps at night. Bird nests resounded with ceaseless warbling, and the noise of waterfalls deafened the ears of men on the bank. Pearly dewdrops continually falling on the ground from the leaves of trees and blades of grass, the gleaming beauty of the ever-blooming blossoms above, and the other everlasting charms of mountain hamlets baffle the description of poets. Book 3, Chapter 29. Description of Leela's life as Arundhati. Description of astral travel in space. Vasistha speaking. Then the two goddesses sat on a cooling village seat, much like the two states of joy and liberation meet in the tranquil spirit of a man knowing the divine spirit. By this time Leela had become personified to the form of pure consciousness through her knowledge of meditation. She had become a seer of 3 times presenting themselves before her. She remembered the whole course of her past life and derived pleasure relating the events of her former life and death. Leela said, "By your favor, O goddess, and by the sight of this place, I recollect all that I did and thought of in past life. Here I grew up to old age, and here I withered and became lean and thin as a skeleton. I was a Brahmini here, and had my body scratched by dried sacrificial grass, kusa. I was the legal wife of my lord and producer of his race. I was employed milking cattle and churning curd. I had been mother of many sons and a kind hostess to my guest. I was devoted to the service of the gods, Brahmins, and good people, and rubbed my body with cow milk and ghee. I cleaned the frying pans and boiling kettles of the house. I boiled food daily with a single bracelet of glass and one of conch shell on my wrist. I served my father, mother, brother, daughters, and son-in-law with their daily meals. Working all day and night, my body was emaciated like that of a domestic servant. Haste and hasten were the words I used to repeat to myself. Being so busy, I was silly and ignorant. Although I was the wife of a Brahmin, I never wondered, not even in a dream, about what I was and what was this world. Fully engaged in the collection of fuel, cow dung, and sacrificial wood and vegetables, I became emaciated in my body, which was wrapped in a worn-out blanket. I used to pick up worms from the earth of the milk cow, and was prompt to water the garden of greens with watering pots in hand. Every day I used to go to the lake and get fresh green grass to feed my tender calves. I used to wash and clean the house every morning and paint the door with the white tints of pasted and powdered rice, gundi. I had to correct my servants with gentle rebukes and tell them to keep within their bounds like the waves in the river. With my infirm body and ears shaking like dried tree leaves and supporting myself on a stick, I lived here under the dread of old age. As she was speaking in this manner and walking with Saraswati about the village in the valley of the mountain, she was astonished to see her former seats of pleasure, and she showed them to the goddess. This was my flowery tree garden, decorated by those torn patala plants, and this was my garden alcove of flowering asokas. This is the bank of pond where the calves were loosely tied to the tree. This is my pet calf, Karnika, which in my absence has refrained from eating the leaves. This is my watering woman, now so weak and dirty in her parents, her eyes daubed in tears from weeping these 8 days in my absence. This, O goddess, is the place where I used to eat and sit, and where I slept and walked. These are the places where I gave and received the things from my attendants. This is my eldest son, Sarma, weeping in the house. This is my milk cow, now gazing on the grassy plain in the forest. I see this portico and these windows, once as dear to me as my own self, smeared with the dry powder of spring holy festival. I see these pulpy gourds, planted with my own hands and dear to me as myself, now spreading themselves over the oven area. I see my relatives wearing Rudraksha beads, who, before I'd put the bonds of life, carrying fuel for life, eyes tearing from the smoke. I see the stony shore peddling its pebbles against forces of the wave that baffle the beach, now covered by bushes. The green meadows were full of leafy plants, dewdrops on their tips. The plains were whitened from hailstones falling on them in the showers. The midday was covered by sunbeams like a white mist of frost. The tea groves resounded with humming of bees fluttering about clustering flowers. The blooming palasa, glowing like a reddish coral, covered trees and land with heaps of crimson flowers. Fruit was flowing in the village stream, carried from shore to shore, and rustic lads loudly jumbled together, eager to lay hold on them. The cool, shady beach of the stream was strewn with pebbles, washed and carried away by the current and covered by leaves falling from the trees. There I see the altar of my house, so beautifully decorated with flowering vines, clusters of fruits, and flowers hanging over its window. Here lived my husband, whose life in its aerial form has fled to the sky, and became lord of the earth, reaching the surrounding seas. I remember how he had fostered the fond wish of obtaining royal dignity, and how ardently he looked forward to its attainment. I see, O goddess, his royal dignity of 8 days, which had seemed to be so long in duration. I see the soul of my husband in the same form as his kingly state, residing in the empty space of this house, invisible to all like the air in the sky, and like the odors borne by the wind. It is in this empty space that his soul is contained within the form of a thumb that contains in its bosom the whole extent of my lord's realm, stretching thousands of leagues in its circumference. I also see the spacious kingdom of my lord in the space of my consciousness, which, by the miraculous power of God, called illusion or Maya, makes room for thousands of mountains. O goddess, now I wish to see the earthly city of my lord again. Let us therefore turn our course that way, as no place is distant to the resolute. Vasistha said. Having said so, Leela bowed down to Saraswati and entered the shrine. Then, like a bird, she flew into the air with the goddess. It was a region devoid of darkness and as fair as the sea at moonlight. Then it became as blue as the body of Narayana and as bright as the back of a locust. They passed above the regions of the clouds and the winds and beyond the spheres of the orbits of the sun and moon. They passed beyond the path of the North Star and the limits of the circuits of the Sadhya deities, spiritual masters, and other celestial beings. From there they ascended to the higher heavens of Brahma and the Tushita divinities, then upward to the sphere of Golaka, the zodiac, and from there to the world of Shiva, and to the sphere of the departed souls of the dead. Passing beyond the spheres of embodied living beings, and of the body souls of the dead, they proceeded far and farther to the unknown regions of empty space. Having passed the ethereal sphere, they saw nothing there except the sun, moon, and stars shining below them. There was only a deep darkness to be seen, filling the whole void of space and appearing like the basin of the water of a universal deluge, and as compact as the impenetrable cavity of a rock. Leela said, "Tell me, O goddess, what happened to the light of the sun and other stars? Where did this darkness, dense like a fist, come from?" The goddess replied, "You have arrived at a place so remote from the spheres of heaven that the light of the stars can never reach it. Just like one at the bottom of a deep, dark pit is unable to see the light of a firefly flitting over it, so sunlight is invisible to one behind the great belt of heaven." Leela said, "Such a great distance we have come. The great luminary of the sun appears as small as an atom below. Tell me, mother, what sort of place lies beyond this region, and how can we get there after traversing this gloomy expanse?" Saraswati said, "Beyond this is the great pole of the universe that is scattered with innumerable nebular stars like particles of dust." Vasistha said, "As they were talking in this manner, they glided imperceptibly to that pole, like a bee saunters over a solitary hut on the height of a mountain. There were at no pains to come down from that precipice, as there is no pain to effect what must certainly come to pass, even though it appears difficult at first. They saw the system of the universe laid naked to their sight, just as a bold navigator beholds a world exposed to his view beyond the wide expanse of waters. They saw the watery expanse to be 10 times greater than the earth, and enveloping like the crust of a walnut. Then there is a latent heat that is 10 times as great as the water, and the surrounding air is as much greater than the water, and then the all-encompassing space of which there is no end. There is no beginning, middle, or end to that infinite space. It produces nothing, like a barren woman of her offspring. It is only an extended expanse, infinite, calm, and without beginning, middle, or end, situated in the Supreme Spirit. Its immensity is as immeasurable as a stone flung with full force from its top. It is impossible for a Garuda bird, flying with all its might at full speed over the course of an entire kalpa age, to reach from one end to the other." Book 3, Chapter 30. Vasistha describes the universe, the cosmic egg, Brahmanda. Vasistha speaking. Within a moment they passed beyond the regions of the earth, air, fire, water, space, and the tracks on the 10 planetary spheres. They reached boundless space from where the universe appears like an egg. Under its vault they saw millions of luminous particles floating in the air, like innumerable bubbles floating on the water of the unlimited ocean of the sphere of consciousness. Some particles were going downward and others rising upward, some turning around and others appeared to their understanding to remain fixed and immovable. These different motions were only apparent as they saw them from different sides. Here there were no up or down, no upside or below, and no going forward or backward. Here there are no directions as men know. There is only one indefinite space in nature, as there is only one consciousness in all being. Yet everything moves in its own way, just like wayward children take their own course. Rama said, "Tell me, sage, why do we refer to up and down, forward and backward, if there is no such thing in space in nature?" Vasistha said, "There is only one space enveloping all things. The worlds seen in the infinite and indiscernible womb of emptiness are like worms moving on the surface of water. All these bodies that move about in the world by their lack of freedom are thought to be up and down relative to our position on earth. So when there are ants on an earthen ball, all its sides are reckoned below that are under their feet, and those above which are above their backs. Such is this ball of earth in one of these worlds, covered by vegetables and animals moving on it, and by gods, demons, and men walking upon it. It is also covered by cities, towns, and mountains, and their inhabitants in production, like a walnut by its shell. Like elephants appearing as pygmies in the Vindhyan mountains, these worlds appear as particles in the vast expanse of space. Everything anywhere is produced from and exists in space. It is always all in all things, which are contained like particles in it. Such is the pure empty space of divine consciousness, which, like an ocean of light, contains these innumerable worlds, which are forever revolving in it, like the countless waves of the sea. Some of these are hollow within, and others are as dark as the darkness in the end of a kalpa age. They are all moving about in the ocean of emptiness, like the waves of the sea. Some are forever whirling about with a jarring noise that is neither heard or known to anyone. It is like the motion of men addicted by their nature to earthly pursuits. Some worlds are growing in form, as if they were newly created. In their development they are like sprouts from seeds newly sown in the ground. Some are melting away like icicles in heat, or like the mountains that melt at the dissolution of the world from burning sun and heavenly fire. Others have been continually falling downward without reaching any ground, until at last they dwindle and melt into divine intellect. Others are fixed in the air like minuscule animals in water, that are moved to and fro by currents, but without any sign of motion or sensation in them. Again, nothing is stable in nature. Everything is as changing as people alter and add to the acts and customs enjoined in the Vedas and Scriptures. There are other Brahmas and other patriarchs, and many Vishnus and many Indras, one after the other. We have different kings of men, and sometimes no ruler of them. Some in this multiform creation are like men or lords of others, and some are creeping and crooked like beings on earth. Some kinds are as plenty as the waters of the ocean, and others have become extinct. Some are as hard as solid stones, and others are as soft as poor insects and worms. Some are of godly figures, some such as giants, while others are of puny human form. Some are quite blind and are suited to darkness. Others are suited to light, some to both. Some are born as gnats, sucking the juice figs. Others are empty within and fly about and feed upon the air. The world is filled with creatures beyond the conception of even yogis. Even we cannot form even a guess of all the beings that fill infinite space. This world is a sphere for these living things, but the great emptiness that spreads beyond is so extensive that the gods Vishnu and others are unable to measure it, even if they were to traverse it for the whole of their lives. Every one of these ethereal globes is encircled by a belt resembling a golden bracelet, and each has an attractive power like the earth to attract other objects. I have told you all about the grandeur of the universe to my best knowledge. I have no knowledge or power to describe anything beyond this. There are many other large worlds unseen by others rolling through the immense space of vacuum, like giddy yaksha demons revel in the dark and dismal deserts and forests. Book 3, Chapter 31. Leela and Saraswati arrive on earth, fate of good and bad fallen in war. Vasistha said, after having seen the worlds in their aerial journey, the ladies arrived on earth and quickly entered King Padma's inner apartment. There they saw the king's dead body lying in state under heaps of flowers, Leela's spiritual body sitting beside the corpse. It was the dead of night, and the residents had fallen into sound sleep one by one. The room was perfumed with the incense of resin, camphor, sandalwood, and saffron. Leela, seeing the house of her late husband and wishing to enter it, came to his tomb in her assumed body. Then she passed through the fictitious, spacious palace of her lord by breaking out of the confines of her body and head, that in yoga terminology are called earthly and worldly environs. Then with the goddess she went again to the bright and spacious temple of the world and quickly entered. She saw her husband's imaginary world, that of King Vidurtha, like a dirty and mossy pool, just like a lioness beholds a mountain cave covered by darkness and clouds. Then the two goddesses entered that empty world with their airy bodies, like weak ants make their passage through the hard crust of the wood apple. There they passed through regions of cloudy hills and skies and reached the surface of the earth, consisting of tracts of land and basins of water. They came to the continent of Jambu, or Asia, situated amid the ninefold petals of the other continents, and from there proceeded to the territory of Leela's husband in the land of Bharata, India. During this time they saw a certain prince, the ruler of Sind, strengthened by other chiefs, making an attack on this land which was the beauty of the world. They saw the air crowded by people of the three worlds who had assembled to see the conflict. They remained undaunted and saw the air crowded by aerial beings in groups like clouds. There were the spiritual masters, Charana and Sura demigods, celestial Gandharvas, supernatural Vidaharas, and other celestial and Apsara nature spirits in large bodies. There were also Bhuta and Pishaka demons, and Rakshasa demon cannibals, while female Vidahara were flinging handfuls of flowers on the combatants like showers of rain. The evil spirit Vitalas, Yakshas, and Kuzmans were looking at the battle with pleasure, taking the shelter of hills to avoid flying arrows and weapons. The imps were flying from the air to keep out of the path of flying weapons. The spectators were excited by the sound of the combatant war cries. Leela, who was standing by with a fan in her hand, was frightened at the imminent dreadful conflict. She smiled in scorn at the boasting on each side. Virtuous people, unable to endure the horrid sight, took to praying with the chief priest to avert the calamity. Indra's messengers were ready with their decorated elephants to bear the souls of mighty heroes to grace the seats of heaven. The demigod Charanas and Gandharvas sang praises of the advancing heroes. Those heavenly Apsara nymphs who liked heroism were glancing at the best combatants. Voluptuous women wished to embrace the arms of the brave. The fair fame of the heroes had turned the hot sunshine to cool midnight. Rama asked, "Tell me, sage, what sort of a warrior is called a hero and becomes a jewel in heaven, and who is an insurgent?" Vasistha answered, "He who engages in a lawful warfare and fights for his king, whether he dies or becomes victorious in the field, is called a hero and goes to heaven. Whoever otherwise kills men in war for an unjust cause and dies is called an insurgent and goes to hell. Whoever fights for unlawful property and dies in battle becomes subject to everlasting hellfire. Whoever wages a war justified by law and custom, that warrior is called both loyal and heroic indeed. Whoever dies in war with a willing mind to protect cattle, Brahmins, and friends, and whoever protects his guests and refugees with all diligence, after his death he truly becomes an ornament in heaven. The king who is steadfast protecting his subject and his own country is called just, and those who die in his cause are called brave. They who die fighting on the side of riotous subjects, or in the cause of rebellious prince or chiefs, are doomed to fire. They who die fighting unjustly against their kings, lawgivers, and rulers are subjected to the torments of hell. A war that is just serves to establish order, but the unsteady who are mindless of the future destroy all order. The hero dying goes to heaven is the common saying. Scriptures call the lawful warrior a hero, and not otherwise. They who suffer wounds while protecting the righteous and good are said to be heroes, otherwise they are insurgents. It was an expectation of seeing such heroes that the maidens of the gods were standing in the air and talking among themselves about becoming the wives of such warriors. The air was decorated by an illumination on high, and by rows of beautiful heavenly cars of gods and masters, and by the presence of celestial maidens who sang in sweet notes and decorated their hair with mandara flowers. Book 3, Chapter 32, The Onset of the War. Vasistha said, Leela, standing in air with the goddess of wisdom, saw the Apsara nymphs dancing with eagerness for the war between combatants below. She saw the armies assemble in her own territory, once governed by her lord. She saw the field of the air no less formidable because of the assembled ghosts. The meeting of the two armies made the ground appear like a billowy sea, or like two clouds meeting in the sky with the appearance of two hostile forces. The battle array of armored warriors, flashing like the fire of heaven, was followed by their commingled blows resembling the rattling of thunder above, deafening the ears and dazzling the sight. Then darts and javelins, spears and lances, and many other missiles began to fall on both sides, like showers of raindrops, hailstones, and meteorites from the sky. Showers of shafts fell with a force that would pierce the wings of Garuda. As they hit the warriors, they covered the glare of the sun off their armor. Combatants stood face to face with their arms lifted, steadily staring at each other, as if they were pictures in a painting. Armies arranged in long regiment, standing in lines opposite each other, repeatedly shouted and answered each other. The battle array of both armies and the drums on each side were stopped by their leader warning against striking the first blow. The space that separated the hostile forces was the breadth of two bows, like a bridge from one another. It looked like a gap caused by winds in the middle of the ocean at the universal deluge. Leaders were drowned in thoughts of fear, of bloodshed and massacre. Cowardly soldiers groaned their hearts with a hoarse noise of croaking frogs. There were many brave ones, eager to yield their precious lives in a trice. Archers stood with bowstrings drawn to the ear, ready to let their pointed arrows loose at a foe. Others stood dreadfully fixed to strike their arms upon the enemy. Many with frowning looks stared sternly at their adversaries. Armor was clashing, the faces of killers were burning with rage, and the faces of cowards turned towards sheltered retreats ready for flight. All stood in doubt of their lives until the end of the war, and the bodies of old men like big elephants were covered with goosebumps. The silence and anticipation of the first blow resembled the calm of the stormy main or the deep sleep of the city at the dead of night. Musical instruments, drum and conch shells were all silent, and a thick cloud of dust covered the face of the earth and sky. The retreaters were flying from their stronger assailants, who kept running after them like sharks after shoals of fish in the sea. The glittering fringes of flags put the ethereal stars to blush, and the lifted goads in the hands of the elephant drivers made a forest of tapering trees in the sky. Arrows flew in the air like flocks of winged tribe, and a loud beating of drums and blowing of pipes resounded in the air. A round phalanx attacked a host of wicked demons, and a squadron in Garuda formation of right and left wings attacked a body of elephants. Somewhere a great howling arose from the vanguard of a body of troops thrown into disorder by a cohort in the form of eagles. In another place many were seen shouting and attacking each other. Warriors of many legions raised a tremendous noise, and the hands of combatants raised a host of large clubs. The glare of dark steel shaded sunbeams like a cloud. Darts hissing in the air resembled the rustling of breeze amidst the dry leaves of trees. Now began the main battle, like the dashing of clouds upon clouds at the end of the Kalpa age. War raged like sea whipped by a hurricane. Big elephants fell in the field like cold black rocks hurled down by gusts of wind. It seemed like infernal spirits had been let loose from their caves of hell to rage in the battlefield with their horrid and dismal figures. The dark clouds of swords hid daylight, and warriors raised their black spears, seemingly bent upon converting the earth into an ocean of bloodshed. Book 3, Chapter 33, The Battle, the Armies Engage. Comment. The whole of this chapter abounds in onomatopoeian alliterations, and is more a play upon words than a display of sense. However, it is interesting for these jingling words and for the names of the weapons in use among the ancients, the El Mitra. Rama said, "Sage, describe this warfare to me, as I love stories of this kind." Vasistha said, "The ladies, in order to have a better view of the battle below, ascended in their imaginary aerial cars to a more retired spot in the higher regions of the sky. At this time the two armies clashed and mingled, fighting each other with shouts like waves dashing against one another in a raging sea. Vidaratha, the lord of the realm, formerly Padma, the husband of Lila, impatient seeing a bold warrior from the other army attack one of his soldiers, used his huge mallet to strike him on the breast. Then the battle raged with the impetuosity of rolling waves in a stormy ocean. Arms on both sides flamed with living fire and flashes of fiery lightning. Now the edges of waving swords glittered in the sky. Cracking and clashing noises filled the air with a hideous crackling. Then flew winged arrows overshadowing sunbeams and emitting a booming noise that hushed the rattling clamor of summer clouds. Armor clashed against armor with a clanking noise, shooting sparks of glistening fire. Arms, hacking and slashing against arms, filled the air with their fragments flying like birds in the air. The shaking arms and legs of the two armies appeared like a force moving on the land. The twang of their bows and the rumbling of discs, crackling like the rattling drive of wheels in heaven, drove away the birds of the air. The hissing of their loosened strings resembled the bee-like buzzing heard in Samadhi. Iron shafts pierced the head of the soldiers like sleets of hailstones, and the crashing of armor broke arms on the mail-clad warriors. Weapons struck brazen armor with a howling noise and clanking sound. Strokes flying like drifts of rainwater dented the face of the air on sides. Steel striking steel made hands ring with a jingling sound, and a continued rapping on arms and clapping of hands raised chit-chat and pit-pat sounds. The whizzing noise as swords were unsheathed was like the hissing of sparks from fire. The sounds of arrows and darts flying in all directions were like the rustling of falling leaves in autumn. The field was filled with blood spouting from throats, separated from bodies, mangled limbs and heads, and broken swords. The flame of fire flaring from armored and blazing the hair of the warriors. The sound of weapons as swordsmen fought and fell raised a giddy and loud jingling. Tall elephants, pierced by spears, poured out torrents of red-hot blood, while their kin gored bodies with shrill cries. Others, crushed by the ponderous mace of their antagonist, creaked grievously under the blows, while heads of slain soldiers swam in rivers of blood over the plain. Here hungry vultures were pouncing upon them, and there the sky was covered by a cloud of dust. Weaponless soldiers fought with their hands, pulling each other down by their hair. Book 3, Chapter 34. The Battle as Seen by Onlookers. Vasistha speaking. The generals and ministers of the warring sides and the aerial spectators of the battles were talking among themselves this way. "See, here the ground has become a lake of blood, with heads of slaughtered hosts floating like lotuses upon it, and there the air has become like the starry heaven, glittering with broken weapons flying like birds in the sky. Behold, the air is red with the particles of the bright red blood borne above by the wind. It is midday, but the sky presents evening clouds with the glow of the setting sun. What are these, says one, that are flying like straws in the sky? They are, says the other, no straws, but the flight of arrows that have filled the air. Another cries that as long as the dust of earth is wet with the blood of the brave, heroes are entitled to glory and have their home in heaven for myriads of years. The Scripture says to fear not the dark swords whose blades are worn by the brave like petals of blue lotuses about their breasts, and the brave are favored in the eyes of the goddess of fortune. The heavenly Apsara nymphs that saw the fighting and felt a desire to embrace the brave. The god of the flowering bow, Kama, the god of love, was busy loosening their waistbands. They beckoned their welcome by waving their reddened palms, by shaking red leaves on trees, by the round glances of their eyes and the blooming blossoms of plants, and by the perfume of their breath and the honey fragrance of flowers. The guardian spirits of the pleasure gardens of paradise sang sweet notes with a woodland choir and danced in the wagging tails of peacocks. As a brave warrior broke the enemy line with his hearty axe, his beloved was breaking his hard heart and spirit with a soft glance of her eyes. It is by my lance, says the lancer, that I have severed the head of my enemy with rings in his ear, like the head of the ascending node of Rahu approaching the disk of the sun. Look, there is a champion hurling blocks of stone attached to the end of a chain, reaching his feet. There is another whirling his wonderful log of wood held in his uplifted arm. There comes that warrior in the form of Yama, the god of the underworld, appearing from the region of the dead spirits and spreading a horrid devastation all around. Come, let us go back the way we came. Look at these ravenous birds greedily plunging their long necks into the flesh of the bodies just separated from their heads, and glutting themselves with the gushing blood. See there the headless trunk of a slain moving to and fro in the field of battle. The eloquent among the spectators were talking to one another about the frailty of human life and the uncertainty of the time of their meeting in the next world. Oh, the stern cannibal of death, says one, that devours entire bodies of armies in one swoop, now weltering in blood, and levels the leveling host to the ground. The showers of arrows falling on the elephants resemble the showers of rainbows on the mountain tops. The darts sticking to their front bones are like bolts of lightning piercing the cliff tops. While a headless body was groveling on the ground for lack of its head was flying on high like a bird on the air, proclaiming its immortality in heaven. The army, harassed by stones slung at their heads, cried to entrap the enemy in the snares set at their feet. Wives that had become apsaras, heavenly nymphs after death, were now eager to claim their husbands, restored by their youth by virtue of falling into the field of battle. The glaring light on a line of lances that had reached the skies seemed like a flight of stairs of golden vistas for the ascent of the brave up to the gates of heaven. The wife of a slain soldier, now a heavenly goddess, taking possession of her husband's fair, gold-like breast, was looking about in search of another. Generals, arms waving, wailed loudly over their fallen armies in the field. They appeared like cliffs on rocks, resounding to the clamorous surge of the sea below. They shouted at warriors to fight their best. They cried out to remove the wounded to the rear and not trample the bodies of their own soldiers, now lying low on the ground. Look, these apsaras are eagerly trying to loosen their hair and advancing with sobbing bosoms to receive the departed warriors, joining their company in their celestial forms. Ah, receive our guests from afar, says one, on the banks of the rivers of paradise, decorated with gold lotus blossoms, and entertain them with fresh water and cooling breeze. Look, there are groups of weapons broken into pieces like bones by their impact, huddled in the air with a jingling sound and shining like stars in the sky. See the stream of deceased souls flowing in arrow-like currents and rolling in whirlpools of flying discs, rapidly gliding with the pebbles and stones flung in the air from the slings. The sky has become like a lake of lotuses with lotus-formed heads of warriors flung aloft in the air, while flying weapons are floating like their stalks with a broken sword all around like their thorns. Flying fragments of flags form the skins of the plants, and the darts sticking to them appear like big black bees fluttering about the mountains moving with the breeze. Arrows sticking to the dead bodies of elephants are like ants on mountain tops, and like timid girls clinging to men's bosoms. Winds unfurling the curling locks of supernatural Vidihara females indicate their approaching nuptials. Like in an augury, the unfolding plumage of fowls predicts success. Lifted umbrellas shine like so many moons on high, and the moon itself, shining above in the form of fair fame, spreads her light like a white canopy over the earth. The brave warrior, soon after his death, assumes a celestial form framed by his own merit, just like a man in a sleep attains the state he imagined to himself in his waking. Flying spears, lances, clubs, and discs are hurtled in the air like shoals of restless fish and sharks moving about constantly in the troubled waters of the sea. Milk-white rags of umbrellas, tattered and shattered by arrow shafts, fly like cranes in the crowded air, appearing like the disk of the moon broken into 1,000 pieces. Fans flying in the air with a hoarse gurgling and seem like waves of the sea lifted in the air, undulating with a babbling noise in the ocean of the sky. Those scraps of fans and umbrellas, ripped by slashing weapons, appear like the laurels of glory flung aloft and flying in the regions of air. Look, O friends, how these flying arrows and showering spears are approaching us with the hits of their spoil, like bodies of locusts bearing away their green booty in the air. Listen to the clanking sound of steel striking by the uplifted arm of an armored soldier, resounding like the loud alarm of the king of death. Hear the tremendous blows of weapons, like the fury of all-destroying tornadoes throwing down mountain-like elephants, their great ivory tusks lying on the ground like waterfalls. Look at the chariot drivers are stopped in their course, struggling to make their way through puddles of blood in which wheels and horses are stuck together like in a bog of quagmire. The jingling of arms and armor and the jangling of swords and steel resound like a lute playing for the dancing of the dire and dreaded Dame of Death. See, the skirts of the sky are reddened by the red particle borne by the winds from streams of blood flowing out of the wounds into the bodies of men, horses, and elephants lying dead in the field. Look at the array of arrows in the air in the shape of a wreath of blossom, falling like lightning from dark black clouds of weapons hanging on high. See the surface of the earth filled with blood-red weapons appearing like faggots of fire strewn over the ground in a universal conflagration. A multitude of weapons mingle together, clashing and breaking one another into pieces, falling down in showers like the innumerable rays of the sun. The fighting of one man among the motionless many is like the play of a magician acting his part for a bewitched audience. See, their indifferent spectators are viewing the battle as a dream, by their prana or inner vision of the mind. The field of battle, where all other sounds are hushed under the clashing of arms, resembles a stage of the martial god Bhairava chanting his pitiless war song in jarring cacophony. The battlefield is turned into a sea of blood filled with the sands of pounded weapons and rolling with the waves of broken discuses. The sky is filled with martial music loudly sounding on all sides. Echoes off the hills seems to challenge one another in their aerial flight and fighting. Alas, for shame, says one, that these arrows flung with such force from bowstrings, flying with such loud hissing, glittering like red-hot lightning, are foiled in their aim of piercing impenetrable armor and glancing off hitting stony hills. Hear me, friend, you are tired of the sight. It is time for us to leave this place before our bodies are pierced by these sharp arrows flashing like fire, and before the day runs its course into the evening. Book 3, Chapter 35, The Battle, Description of the Battlefield. Comment. First, the battleground is compared with the sky, then with the sea, next with a forest, and last with the final doomsday. V.L. Mitra. Vasistha said, Then waves of cavalry mounting to the sky made the battlefield appear like a raging sea. Moving umbrellas floated as its foam and froth, and feathered silvery arrows glided like finny pearly fish, while cavalry, chargers, and flights heaved and dashed like surges of the sea. Rushing of weapons resembled the running of its currents, and circle of soldiers were its whirlpools. The elephants were like its islets, and their motions resembled the rock moving in it. Whirling discs were its eddies, and long hair flying on heads its floating weeds. Sparkling sands were its shining waters, and the flash of sword its glassy spray. Gigantic warriors were its whale and alligators, and the resounding caves like its gurgling whirlpool. Flying arrows were its swimming fishes, and floating flags resembled its uprising waves and boars. Shining weapons formed the waters of this ocean and their whirlpool also, while the long lines of force appeared like a huge and horrible bodies of its whales. Soldiers clad in black iron armor were like the dark blue waters of the deep, and headless bodies groveling in dust were like the whirling currents of the sea, which scattered weapons like seaweed. Showers of arrows hid the skies with a mist, and the confused rattling of the battlefield was like the roaring of clouds. Flying and falling heads of slain soldiers resembled large drops of rain, and their bodies were like pieces of wood whirling in the eddies of the discs. The bold archer, bending his strong bow in the form of a curve and leaping above the ground, resembled a spouting sea rising from under the ground with heavy waves. The unnumbered umbrellas and flags that were moving up and down the field were like the foaming and frothing of the sea rolling in waves of blood and carrying away the beams and timbers of broken chariots in its currents. The army's march resembled the flow of seawater, and the blood spouting from the wounds of elephants were like its bubbles, while the moving horses and elephants represented the sea animals in their motion. The battlefield had become like a wonderful field in the air in which the furious war, like a tremendous earthquake, shook hills like moving clouds in the sky. Here the waves were undulating like flights of birds in the air, and groups of elephants falling around like rocks, and the cowardly ranks murmured like herds of frightened deer. The field has become a forest of arrows. Wounded soldiers are standing fixed on the ground like trees, arrows flying like locusts, and horses moving like antelopes. Here a loud drum sounded like the humming of bees in the hollow of trees. The army appears like a mist with a bold warrior sprawling like a lion in it. Dusk was rising in clouds and forces falling like rocks. Huge broken chariots looked like hills, and flaming swords shined on all sides. The rise and fall of soldiers' feet flitted like falling flowers on the ground, and flags and umbrellas rose above it like clouds. All was covered with streams of blood, and high-sounding elephants fell like thundering showers of rain. The war was like the last doom of death ready to devour the world, destroying flags, banners, umbrellas, and chariots in a confused chaos. Shining weapons fell like fragments of the bright sun, burning all things like a burning pain, and flames the soul and mind. The stretched bows were like rainbow, and falling arrows like showers of rain. Flying sabers resembled forked lightning, and their falling fragments like sparkling hailstones. The dire massacre made a sea of blood, with hurling stones as its shoals and rocks. Flying arms resembled stars falling from heaven. The sky was like a sea full of whirlpools of discs hurled through the air. There were burning fires performing funerals on the slain. Missiles were like bolts of thunder that struck rock like elephants dead in the field to block the passage of men. Earth and sky were hidden by a thick cloud of showering arrows, and the army below was a sea of tempestuous warfare and bloodshed. Destructive weapons were flying on all sides, like huge dragons of the sea carried aloft by gusts of wind from the stormy main. The flying arms of bolts, swords, discs, pikes, and lances were blazing, and breaking one another in the air with such hideous noise that it seemed to be a second deluge, when the last tornado blew up everything on high, scattering them in all directions, crushing and smashing them with a tremendous peal. Book 3, Chapter 36, The Battle, Duels Between Equals, Catalogue of Forces. Vasistha speaking. Heaps of arrows rising in spires above the ground drove the cowards and the wounded far away from the battlefield. Hills of dead bodies of men, horses and elephants, heaving in promiscuous heaps and appearing like clouds fallen upon earth, invited the demon yakshas, rakshasas, and carnivorous panakas to come and play in the wide ocean of blood. Now there commenced a contest between men of equal rank and virtue among those of good character, valor, and strength on both sides. All took part in the combat, even holy householders. They fought duels like one cloud clashing with another, and like the confluence of two streams discharging their fury against each other. As a rib is joined to another, and one side with the other, so met horse against the horse, and elephant against elephant in mutual conflict. As one forest clasps and clings to another, and as one hill is linked with another in a range, so the duelists struggled with each other like one wave dashing against the other. Footmen fought with footmen like reeds crush reeds, and bamboo strikes each another in a swirling wind. Chariots fell upon chariots and broke each other into pieces. Citizens beat rustics like the gods smote the demons of old. The sky, which had been clouded by flights of arrows, was now emblazoned by the archer's banner, resembling a rainbow of various colors. At last the warriors, who were overpowered in their conflict, fled from the field as people do from a fire. Now armor-bearers with discuses met in contest with those who shielded against discs. Archers opposed archers, and swordsmen challenged the other side's sword fighters. So hookers and crookers challenged their co-rivals with crowbars in hand. Maces were opposed to maces, and lancers were set against the lance-bearers in fighting. Spearmen braved spearmen, and the throwers of missiles were crossed with missiles in hand. Mallets fought against mallets, and clubs were opposed by clubsmen in a conflict. Combatants with pikes encountered pikemen face to face, and iron rods were crossed in strife against pointed tridents. Fighters with missile weapons counteracted the missiles of their enemies, and those fighting with battle axes resisted the pole axes and pickaxes of their foes. Trappers with their traps and snares attacked the darters of nooses and lassos. Those who threw javelin withstood the javelins of the throwers on the other side. Daggers opposed daggers, and cudgels fought cudgels. Combatants with iron gloves opposed boxers with iron fisticuffs, and those with iron cranes in hand pursued fighters with crooked goads. Warriors with plowshares attacked plowmen, and those with tridents fell upon the opposing trident holders. Champions with chained armor set upon soldiers attired in mail. They poured on the field like flights of locusts, or like the waves in a troubled sea. The air also appeared like a sea, with flying discs whirling like whirlpools, and the flight of reeds whistling like gusts of wind. Various flying weapons seemed like sharks and dolphins moving about it. The sky of the heavens became the great deep of the sea, impassable by celestials owing to the waves of weapons moving like sea monsters in the air. Thus the armies of two belligerent rulers, each composed of 8 divisions as described below, furiously engaged one another. Now hear me relate to you the forces on the side of Padma, now named King Vidarothra, and the allied powers that came to his side from the central and eastern district. There came the hardy warriors of Kosala and Benares, those of Magadha and Utkala, situated in the east, and the Makalas of Vindhya range, the Karkars of Karnatic, and the Madras in the south, the chiefs of Hema and Rudras, and the Tamils from the south, the Pergoshas and the horse-faced Osmaks and Abathatha cannibals. Then they joined the Varna Kashtas and the Vishwatras, and the eaters of raw food and flesh, and the fish-eaters, and those whose face like tigers, the Karatas, with the Savaras and one-legged people. Next came the mountaineers of Malyavana, Sibara, and Anjaragiri, and others having the insignia of bulls and lotuses, and the people of the sun rising mountain in the east. Those that joined from the south are the following, namely, the Vendraras, the Cheetahs, the Vatsas, the Dasanaras, near the confluence of the 10 streams, and the Angas, the Bangas, Upabangas of Upper and Lower Bengal. They met from the south were Kalangas, Pundras, Jatharas, Vidaharas, and the hill people, the Sabaras, the outcast tribals, the Karnas, and the Tripura people. Those named Kantakas from their thorny district, the unenlightened Komalas, the Kanaras, the Andres, the Cholas, and the people of the borders of the Charmanvati River. The Kokas, or bald-headed and bearded people, and those of the Hamakuta Hills, the frizzled and long-necked people, and the inhabitants of Kishkinda and Koka Forest. The princes that joined with Leela's husband from the south were as follows: the Vindyas, the Kushamians, or Patna, the Mahandras, and the Durduras, the Malays and the Solar race, and the prince of the 33 United States, and the rich and united cities of Avanti and Sambhavati, and those of Dasapura, of Katha, Chakra, Rishka, Kuch, and others, and the foresters of Upagiri and Badagiri hills, the prince of Nagori and the chief of Dandaka forest, and the joint states of the people, the Sahas, Saivas, and the hill people of the Rishamuka and the Karkata and Vimbila forests. Then came the inhabitants from the banks of Pampa, the Karakas, the Kavaras, with the Kirakas, Asikas, and the people of Drumapanatna. Next came the Kashakas and Kalukas, the Yadas, the Tamaparkas, Garadas, the Kanakas, and the people of Dinapatam. The Tamils, Kadamaharas, Sahakaras, and deer hunters, the Vaidutas, Tumbavanas, and those attired in deer and elephant skin. Then came the lotus-like Sibas and Konkans, and the inhabitants of Chitrakuta mountain, with the people of Karnata, the Mantas, Batakas, and those of Khatan. The Andhras and Kola Hill people, the Avantas and Cheetahs, with the Chandas and Devankas and Krunchavahas. At last came the people from the 3 peaks of Chitrakuta mountains, called the Silakara, Nanda, Mardana, and Malaya, which were the seats of the guardian Bakshas of Lanka. Then those of the southwest, there's the great realm of Surat, with the kingdoms of the Sindh, Savira, and Bira, Dravidas in Deccan. Also those of the district of Kikata, Siddhakanda, and Kalahura, and Mount Hemagiri, or Golden Hills, and the Ravata Range. Then the warriors of Jaya Kuchara and Mewar, and also the Yavanas and Balakas, and the Marganas or nomads, and the gray-colored Tumbas on the north. Then there came Lasha races and many hill people, inhabiting the borders of the sea, forming the limit of the dominion of Leela's husband on the north. Now know the names of the countries belonging to the enemy in the west, and those composed of the following mountain ranges, namely Mount Maniman and the Kurapana hills, with the hillocks of Vanorka, Meghabhava, and Chakravana mountain. There is the country of 5 peoples, limiting the territory of the Kasha Brahmins, and after that the Braksha, the Paraka, Santika countries. Then stretch the countries of the Saivas, Amarakas, Pachata, Gudavas, and then the Haya country, and those of the Suhais, Gayas, Tajikas, and Hunas. Then along the side of some of the countries there is the range of Karka hills, inhabited by barbarous people, devoid of caste, custom, and limits of moral duties. Thence stretches of country hundreds of leagues in length to the boundary mountains of Mahandra, abounding in rich stones and gems. After that stands the Aswa range with hundreds of hills about it, and extending to the dread ocean of the north, of the Payatra range. On the northwestern side there are countries beyond the mountain range of Asia, where Venupati was the king of the land. Then there are the countries of the Pulagantas, of the Mandayas, and many other people, and those of the Parakundas and Paras as bright as the orb of the sun. Then the races of Vanmilas and Nalanas and the Durgas, who are so called from their tall statures and long arms and hair. Then there are the Rangas, Stanikas, with protuberant breasts, and the Garuhas and Chahulas. After that is the kingdom of women, where they feed upon bullocks and heifers, now about the Himalayas and its hills in the north of India. These are the Karancha and Madhuman hills, and the Kailasa, Vasuman and the Sumara peaks, at the foot of which are the people known under many names. Besides these there met the warlike tribes of India, consisted of the Madras, Malavas, and Surasenas, the Rajputs of the race of Arjuna, the Trigartas, and the one-legged people and Kudras. There were the Abalas, Prakalas, and Sakas, the Kamadurtas, Dasahandras, Kavasanas, and club fighters, the Dahandas and Sarakas and Patahandas also, with the islanders and Gandharas and Invanti warriors of Malwa, the warlike Taxilas, the Balavas, Godhanas, and the renowned warriors of Pushkara. Then there were the Tikshas and Kalavaras, and the inhabitants of the cities of Kahaka and Surabuti likewise. There were many of the people of the Rakadarsa, and Antadarsa also, and the Pingalas, the Pandyas, Yamanas, and Yatahana demons too. There were also the races of men known as Hematalas and Osmaks, together with the hilly tribes inhabiting the Himalaya, Vasuman, Krancha, and Kalasa mountains. Hear me now relate to you the people that came from the northeast quarter, which extends 180 leagues in its circumference. There came also the Kalutas, and the Brahmaputras, the Kunidas and Kudanas, with the warlike Malavas, and the champions of the Randra and four estates. Then there were the Kadavas and Sinahapras of dwarfish stature, the Sabas, the Kachas, the Palavas, the Kamiras, and the Doradas. They were also the people of Abhisha, the Jigavrakas, the Balulas, the Kuvs, the Karatas, and the Yamapatas, together with the poor and rich people of desert land and tracts of gold. Thus Leela in one vision saw the homes of the gods in the forest land and the earth in all their beauty. She saw all the seats of opulence in the building which they were adorned. She saw the summit of Kailash and the delightful grove at its feet, and the level lands traversed by the aerial cars of Vidyahara and other celestial beings. Book 3, Chapter 37. The Battle Catalogue of Forces Continued. Comment. It is not easy to say whether this lengthy description of the battle is Vasistha's or Valmiki's own making. Both of them were well acquainted with military tactics. Vasistha was the general of King Sudasa against the Persians. Valmiki was the epic poet of Rama's war with Ravana in the celebrated Ramayana. These descriptions are left out in the translations of this work as entirely useless in yoga philosophy, without regard that they form the preliminary step to Rama's military education, which he was soon after called to complete under the guidance of Vishwamitra in his hermitage, V.L. Mitra. Vasistha said, "Thus the ravaging war was making a rapid end of men, horse, elephant, and all. The brave coming foremost in the combat fell in equal numbers on both sides. These and many others were reduced to dust and ashes. The bravery of the brave served only to send them like poor moths to the fire and flame of destruction. Now know the names of the central districts, not yet mentioned by me, that sent their warriors to the field, in favor of the consort prince of Leela. They were the island forces of Sursena, the Gudas, and the Asganas, the Madhyamikas, and they that dwell in the tropics, the Salukas and Kodmals, and Pipalanas, the Mandavayas, Pandyas, Surgrivas, Gurjars, the Parayatras, Kurashetras, Yamanas, Udavaras, the Rajwaras, Ujjanas, the Kalkuttas, and the Mathuras or Mutra, the Panchalas, the northern and southern Damakartra, the Kurashetriyas, Panchakalas, and Saraswatas. The line of war chariots from Avanti, being opposed by the arm of the warriors of the Kunta and Panchanda districts, fell in fighting by the side of the hill. Those arrayed in silk cloth, being defeated by the enemy, fell upon the ground and were trodden down by elephants. The brave of Daspura, being hacked in their breast and shoulders by enemy weapons, were pursued by the Banabuna warriors and driven to a distant pool. The Santikas, being ripped in their bellies, lay dead and motionless in naked field, wrapped in their mangled entrails that were torn and devoured by the ferocious Pashakas at night. Veteran and outspoken warriors of Badrisi, well skilled in the battlefield, drove the Armagas into a ditch like tortoises to their pits. The Hahayas were driving the Dandakas, who fled like fleet stags, flying with the swiftness of winds, gushing blood drawn by pointed, piercing enemy arrows. The Doradas, gored by the tusks of enemy elephants, were carried away like broken tree branches in the flood by their blood. The Chinas, bodies mangled by darts and arrows, cast themselves into the wadi, their bodies a burden they could no longer bear. The demons, pierced in their necks by the Karnak lancers, fled in all directions like faggots of fire, or like the flying meteors of heaven. The Sakas and Desakas fought each other by pulling the other's hair, as if whales and elephants were struggling mutually with their respective elements. Fleeing cowards were trapped in snares cast by the Dasarna warriors, like dolphins hiding under reeds, are dragged out by the nets of a blood-red shore. The Tonga's swords and pikes destroyed the Guruja forest by the hundreds, and like razors shaved the heads of hundreds of Guruja women. The luster of the warriors' weapons illuminated the land like flashes of lightning, and clouds of arrows rained like showers in the forest. A flight of the crowbars obscured the sun and frightened the Abhira warriors with the dread of an eclipse. They were as surprised as if ambushed by a gang of plunderers after their cattle. Handsome gold-collared, tawny-colored Tamra soldiers were dragged by the Gouda warriors as captors snatched their fair captives by the hair. Like cranes by vultures, Tongans were beset by Kansasas with their blazing weapons, destroying elephants and breaking discuses. The rumbling noise raised by Gauda warriors whirling their cuddles frightened the Gandharas so much that they were driven from the field like a herd of beasts, or like the fearful Dravidas. A host of Saka warriors, dressed in black like the mist of night, poured like a blue torrent from the blue sky before their white-robed foes, the Persians. The crowded array of arms, lifted in the clear and bright sky, appeared like a thick forest under a milk-white ocean of frost that shrouds the mountainous region of Mandara. From below, the flights of arrows appeared like cloud fragments in the sky, and when viewed from above by the celestials, appeared like waves on the sea. The air was a forest thickly beset by trees of spears and lances, with arrows flying like birds and bees, and innumerable umbrellas with their gold and silver mounting appearing as so many moons and stars in the sky. Kakayas made loud shouts like the war whoops of drunken soldiers. Conchas covered the field like a flight of cranes, and the sky was filled with dust over their heads. The Karata army made a murmuring sound like the effeminate voice of women, causing the lusty Angus to rush upon them with a furious roar. Cassia's bodies covered with kusa grass appeared like birds with feathers and raised clouds of dust by flapping their feathered arms. The whirling warriors of Narmada's coast came rushing unarmed into the field and began to mock, deride, flout, and move about in their merry mood. Low-statured Sawatis came with bells jingling on their waistbands, flinging their arrows in the air and throwing showers of their darts. The soldiers of Sibi were pierced by spears hurled by the Kuntas. They fell as dead bodies in the field, but their spirits fled to heaven in the form of Vijyaharas. A mighty light-footed army took possession of the field, and in its quick march laid the Pundagaras groveling on the ground. Big Punjabis and furious warriors from Benares crushed the bodies of stalwart warriors with their lances and cudgels, like elephants crush mighty trees under their feet and tusk. Burmese and Vetsenis were outdone by the discs of the Nepalese. Saws cut down sayas like withered trees. Heads of white kaka were looped off with sharp axe. Their neighboring prince of Badaras was burnt down by the fiery arrows. Mantanjaras fell under the hands of Koshadotas like old unchained elephants fall into a miry pit. Others who came to fight fell like dry fuel in a blazing fire. Mitragartas fell in the hands of Trigartas and were scattered about the field like straw, and having their heads struck off as they fled, they entered the infernal regions of death. The weak vanilla force, falling into the hands of the Magadha army that resembled a sea gently shaken by the breeze, went down in the sand like thin, aged elephants. Cheetahs lost their lines fighting the Tongans and lay withered on the battlefield, like scattered flowers fading under the shining sun. Kosalas were unable to withstand the war cry of the deadly Pauravas, routed by showers of clubs, arrows, and darts. Those pierced by pikes and spears looked like coral plants, red with blood all over their bodies, and fled to the sheltering hills like red-hot suns of the setting mountains. Flights of arrows and weapons, carried away by strong winds, moved in the air like cloud fragments with a swarm of black bees hovering under them. Flowing arrows, wandering with the roar of elephants, appeared to be showering clouds. Their feathers appeared on the holy breed. Their reedy shafts seemed like trees. Wild elephants and people on the plains were all torn to pieces like bits of torn linen. War chariots where broken wheels fell into pits like the broken crags of mountains. The enemy stood upon their tops like a thick mist or cloud. The host of stalwart warriors meeting on the battlefield gave it the appearance of a forest of palm and tamura trees. But when weapons chopped off their arms, they made it appear like mountainous wood with clumps of stunted pine trees. The youthful maidens of paradise were filled with joy and glee to find the groves of their native hill, Meru, full of brave champions fallen in the field. The forest of the army howled in a tremendous roar until it was burnt down by all-devouring fire of the enemy. Hacked by the Asamesi, their weapons snatched by the Bhutas, the Dasarnas threw away their staffs and fled like a herd of cows. The Kasayas, by their valor, were eager to despoil the tinsels from the dead body of the chiefs, like summer heat robs the beauty from lotuses in a drying pool. Tushakas were beset by Masalas with darts, spears, and mallets. The sly Katakas were defeated and driven away by the Narakas. Kuntas was surrounded by Pratha warriors and were defeated like good people by the treachery of the wily. The elephant drivers who had struck off the heads of their hosts in a thrice were pursued by harpooners and fled with their severed heads like the lotus flowers plucked by their hands. The Saraswatas fought off both sides with one another until it was evening, and yet no party was a loser or gainer, just like a learned discussion among pundits or lawyers. The puny and short-statured Deccans, driven back by the demons of Lanka, redoubled their attack against Thera, that like smoldering fires rekindled by fresh fuel. Rama, what more shall I say about this war which baffles even Sesha, with his 100 tongues and mouth to attempt a full description? Book 3, Chapter 38. The battle, end of the day, the battlefield after cessation of fighting. Vasistha continued. Now as the war waged fiercely, with mingled shouts on both sides, the sun shrouded the polished armor under the midst of darkness and was about to set. The waters of limpid streams glided over the showers of stones flung by the forces that fell on the fading clusters of lotuses growing in them. The clashing of shafts and darts glittered like flashes of fire in the sky, and waves of arrows were seen, now approaching close and then receding at a distance. Below, severed heads floated in whirlpools of blood like lotuses, while above the sea of heaven was filled with flying weapons, moving like marine animals. The rustling of the breeze and the whistling of the clouds of weapons frightened the aerial masters and woodland apes with fear of an approaching rain. The day declined after it had run its course of 8 watches and assumed the graceful countenance of a hero returning in glory after he has fought his battle. The army, like the day, declined in splendor, being battered in its cavalry and shattered in its force of elephants. Army commanders, in concert with the ministers of war, sent envoys to the hostile parties for a truce to the fighting. Both parties, seeing how much they lost in the engagement, agreed to a truce, and the soldiers gave their assent with one voice. They hoisted their soaring banners of truce on the top of the highest chariots, and a mounted crier on each side proclaimed the truce to the armies below. They unfurled white flags on all sides, which, like so many moons in the gloom of night, proclaimed peace on earth by cessation from fighting. Then the drums delivered their loud peals, resounding by the roaring of clouds above and all about. The flights of arrows and the weapons that had been raging like fire in the sky now began to fall in the torrents on the ground below, like the currents of Lake Manasavor. Hands and arms of warriors rested their feet like the shaking of trees in the surges of the sea end after an earthquake. The two armies went their own ways from the field of battle, like inlets of the sea run into the land in different directions. The armies being at rest, there was an end to all agitation in the field, like ocean waves are lulled to rest with a calm after being churned by Mandara mountain. In an instant the battlefield became as dreadful as a dismal womb of death, and as deep and dark as the hollow pit of the sea after Augustus sucked up its waters. It was covered with the dead bodies of men and beasts, and flowed with the floods of purpling blood. It resounded with a sound of insects, like a heath with the humming of beetles. Gory bodies gushed with blood and gurgled like sea waves. The cries of the wounded wanting to live pierced the ears and throbbed the heartstrings of the living. The dead and wounded rolling around side by side in streams of blood made the living think the dead were still alive like themselves. Big elephants lying dead in piles on the field appeared like cloud fragments, and the heaps of broken chariots looked like a forest blown over by a storm. Streams of blood flowed with the dead bodies of horses and elephants, and heaps of arrows, spears, mattocks, and mallets flowed between them with broken swords and missiles. Horses were lying in their halters and harnesses. Dead soldiers were wrapped in their mail and armor. Flags, fans, turbans, and helmets lay scattered in the field. The winds rustled by the opening of quivers like the hissing of snakes or the whistling of the breeze in the holes of the bamboo tree. Flesh-eating Pashaka demons were rolling on beds of dead bodies as if they were beddings of straw. The gold chains from the helmets and head ornaments of fallen soldiers glittered with rainbow colors, and greedy dogs and jackals tore at the entrails of the dead like long ropes or strings. The wounded were gnashing their teeth in the field of blood, like the croaking of frogs in a miring pool of blood. Those dressed in party-colored coats with 100 spots now had their arms and thighs gushing in 100 streams of blood. Friends wailed bitterly over the bodies of their dead and wounded lying amidst heaps of arrows and weapons. Broken cars and scattered trappings of horses and elephants had covered the land. Headless trunks of demons danced about with uplifted arms touching the sky. The stink of carrion, fat and blood, filled nostrils with nausea. Elephants and horses of noble breed lay dead or gasping with their mouth gaping upwards. Streams of blood dashing against their rock-like bodies beat as loudly as drums. Blood gushing out of wounded horses and elephants ran like that to a wounded whale in 100 streams. Blood spouting from the mouth of dying soldiers flowed into 100 channels. Those pierced with arrows in their eyes and mouth uttered an inaudible voice with their last gasp of death. Those pierced in their bellies had their bowels gushing out with a horrible stench. The ground was reddened with thickened blood issuing out of the wounds. Half-dead elephants grasped headless trunks with their trunks, while the loose horses and elephants that had lost their riders were trampling over dead bodies at random. The weeping, crying, and tottering wives of fallen soldiers fell upon their dead bodies, weltering in blood, embracing them closely by their necks, then made an end of themselves with the same weapons. Groups of soldiers were sent with guides to fetch dead bodies from the field. The hands of their living companions were busily employed dragging the dead. The field had become a wide river running with waves of blood, breaking into 100 whirling streams, and carrying severed heads like lotuses and the torn braids of the hair floating like bushes. Men were busy taking weapons from the bodies of the wounded, who lamented loudly on account of their dying in a foreign land and losing their arms, armor, horses, and elephants. Dying souls remembered their sons and parents, their dear ones, and their adored deities. They called out their names and sighed and sobbed with heart-rending sounds. The brave who died cursed their fates, and those who fell fighting elephants blamed the unkind gods they adored in vain. Cowards fearing to be killed resorted to base flight, but the dauntless brave stepped forward into the whirlpool of blood. Some, suffering under the agony of arrows stuck in their mortal parts, thought upon the sins of their past lives that had brought such pain upon them. Blood-sucking Vitalagos advanced with their horrid mouth to drink blood from headless torsos. Below, the floating flags, umbrellas, and fans looked like light lotuses in a lake of blood, while from above the evening stretched her train of stars like red lotuses in an ethereal sea. The battlefield looked like an eighth sea of blood. The war chariots were its rocks and their wheels its whirlpool. The flags were its foam and froth, and the white fans its bubbles. The field of blood, with scattered chariots plunged in mud and mire and covered with broken pieces of wood, looked like a tract of land devastated by a hurricane. It was as desolate as a country burned by fire, or like the dry bed of the sea sucked up by the sage Agayasta. It was like a district devastated by a sweeping flood. The battlefield was filled with heaps of weapons as high as the body of big elephants, lying dead about the ground. The lances carried down by streams of blood were as big as the palm trees growing on the summits of mountains. Weapons sticking in elephant bodies seemed like shining flowers growing on green trees. Their entrails, torn and carried away by vultures, spread a fretted network in the sky. Lances stuck in the ground by streams of blood made a woody forest on the banks of the Red River, and the flags floating on the surface were like a bush of lotuses in liquid blood. Friends pulled dead bodies from the bloody pool in which they drowned, and men marked the bodies of big elephants by the jutting weapons sticking in them. Trunks of trees that had their branches lopped off by the weapons looked like headless bodies of slain soldiers, and the floating carcasses of elephants seemed like so many boats swimming in a sea of blood. White garments swept down by the current looked like a froth on a pool of blood. They were picked up by servants sent to search them out. The demonic bodies of headless soldiers were rising and falling in the field, hurling large wheels and disses upon the flying army on all sides. Dying warriors were frothing forth floods of blood from their throats, and stones stained with blood were inviting greedy vultures to devour them. Then there were groups of Sutala, Vitala, and Utala demons and ghosts dancing about the field with their war dances, whirling the broken bits of war chariots upon the flying soldiers on all sides. The stir and last gasp of the dying were fearful to behold, and the faces of the dying and the dead covered in dust and blood were pitiful to the beholder. Devouring dogs and ravenous ravens had pity as they saw the last gasp of the dying. Carrion feeders were howling and fighting over carcasses until many of them became dead bodies from fighting each other. Now I have described the sea of blood that flowed fast with the gore of unnumbered hosts of horses, elephants, and camels, and of warriors and their leaders, and the multitudes of cars and war chariots. But it became a pleasure garden to the god of death, delighting in his bed of bloodshed and grove of weapons strewn all around. Book 3, Chapter 39, The Battlefield Infested by Nocturnal Fiends. Vasistha speaking. Now the blood-red sun set down on the west like a hero red with blood. The sun hid its luster, which was dimmed by the brightness of the weapons of war in the western main. The sky which had reflected the blood-red flush of the field of blood was now dimmed by the setting of the glorious sun, and darkened by the veil of evening. Thick darkness spread over the face of heaven and earth, like the waters of the great deluge, and there appeared a body of Vatala ghosts, dancing in a ring and clapping their hands. The face of day, smeared with the blackness of nightfall, was painted by the light of evening with stars like pearly spots painted on the cheeks of an elephant. The busy buzz of creation became silent in the dead darkness of night, like the humming of bees over the surface of the waters. The hearts of men were closed in sleep as in death, like the petals of the lotus at night. Birds lay in their nests with folded wings and crest, like dead bodies were lying in the field covered with their wounds and weapons. Then fair moonbeams shone above, and white lotuses were blown below. The hearts of men were gladdened, and the victors felt joyous in themselves. The ruddy evening assumed the shape of the blood-red sea of battle, and the fluttering bees now hid themselves like the face of fallen soldiers. There was an ethereal lake above, dotted on high with stars like white lotuses, and here was the earthly lake below, beset by lotuses resembling the stars of heaven. Bodies thought to be lost in darkness were now recovered in moonlight, like gems hidden under water or found scattered about. The battlefield was filled with Vatala ghosts howling with their hideous cries, while bodies of vultures, crows, and owls tore at carcasses and sported with skeletons. Funeral pyres blazed as brightly as the starry frame on high, and the fires consumed dead bodies with their bones and clothing. The fire burnt bodies and bones to ashes, after which it extinguished itself, as if satiated with plenty. The female fiends now began to sport in the water. There arose a mingled cry of dogs, crows, and yaksha demons, and Vatalas clapping their hands. Bodies of ghosts, thick as wood and forest, were moving about. Dakinis were eager to steal away the flesh and fat from the piles of bodies gathered for funeral, and Pashakas delighted in sucking the blood, flesh, and bone of the dead. The demons were now looking and now lurking about the funeral piles, and the Raksha demons that rushed it carried away carcasses on their shoulders. There came also bodies of Feroshas, Kumbandas, and big Damaras, uttering their barbarous cries and hovering in the shape of clouds over the fumes of fat and flesh. Bodies of Vatalas stood in the streams of blood, like earthly beings, and snatched the skeletons with hideous cries. Vatala younglings slept in the bellies and chests of the elephants, and Rakshasas were drinking their fill in the bloody field. Giddy Vatalas fought one another with the lighted faggots on the piers, and the winds blew the stench of the putrid carcasses on all sides. Female fiends, Rupikas, filled the baskets of their bellies with carrion with a rat-a-tat noise. Yaksha cannibals were snatching half-burnt carcasses from the funeral piers as their roasted meat and dainty food. Aerial imps, Kagas, attacked the dead bodies on the big bangas and black kalingas, and fluttered about with their open mouth, emitting a blaze of falling meteors. Vatala ghosts fell down in the dark and discolored blood pits, lying hidden in the midst of heaps of dead bodies, while Pashaka ogres and the leaders of Yogini sprites laughed at them for their false step. Entrails being pulled vibrated like the strings of musical instruments. The ghosts of men that had become fiends from their fiendish desires fell to fighting one another. Valiant soldiers were frightened at the sight of female fiends, and funeral rites were disturbed by the Vatala and Raksha demons. The demons of the night were frightened at the fall of carcasses from the soldiers of elves, who were carrying them aloft in the air, where they were waylaid by a throng of ghostly demons, Bhutas and Kata. Many dying bodies were lifted with difficulty by demons, who, when they found the bodies unfit for their food, let them fall down dead on the ground. Pieces of blood-red flesh that fell from the fiery jaws of jackals looked like clusters of asoka flowers strewn all around the funeral ground. Vatala urchins were busy putting scattered heads over the headless bodies of Kabanas, and the bodies of Yaksha, Raksha, and Pashaka ogres flashed like firebrands in the sky. At last a thick cloud of darkness covered the face of the sky, and the hills, valleys, gardens, and groves became hidden under an impenetrable gloom. Infernal spirits were loosened from their dismal abodes, and ravaged at large over the battlefield, like a hurricane under the vault of heaven. Book 3, Chapter 40, Subtle Body and Astral Travel, Intellectual Body, Details on the Process of Death, Conception and Birth. Vasistha related, the nocturnal fiends infested the gloomy field, and the attendants of Yama, the Lord of Death, roamed about it like marauders in the daytime. Under the canopy of thick darkness, naked and fleeting ghosts in their nightly abode reveled on their provisions of carrion that was likely to be taken by the clutches of one's hand. It was in the still hour of this gloomy night, when the hosts of heaven seemed to be fast asleep, that a sadness stole in upon the mind of Leela's magnanimous husband, the warring king Vidaratha. He thought about what was to be done the next morning in council with his counselors, and then he went to his bed, which was as white as moonlight and as cold as frost. For a while his lotus eye was closed in sleep in his royal camp, which was as white as moonbeams and covered by the cold dews of night. Then the two ladies issued forth from their empty abode and entered the tent through a crevice, like air penetrates into the heart of an untouched flower bud. Rama asked, how is it possible, sage, that the gross bodies of the goddesses with their limited dimensions could enter the tent through one of its holes, as small as the pore of a piece of cloth? Vasistha answered, saying that it is impossible for someone who mistakes himself to be a material body to enter a small hole with that gross body, but it is possible to go anywhere one pleases if he understands that he is only pent up in his physical body, like in a cage and obstructed by it in its flight. And if he does not believe that he is confined by his material body, but has the true notion of his inner subtle spirit, he who perceives his original spiritual state to be the better half of his body may pass as a spiritual through a chink, but whoever relies on the lesser half of the material body cannot go beyond it in the form of his intellect. As air rises upward and the flame of fire never goes downward, so the nature of spirit is to rise upward, and that of the body to go down, but the intellect is made to turn in the way in which it is trained. A man sitting in the shade has no notion of feeling heat or warmth, so one man has no idea of another man's knowledge or thoughts. As is one's knowledge, so is his thought. Such is the mode of his life. It is only by means of ardent practice of meditation and learning that the mind is turned to the right course. One's belief of a snake in a rope is removed by knowledge of his error. The habits of the mind and conduct in life are changed from wrong to right by the knowledge of truth. It is one's knowledge that gives rise to his thoughts, and thoughts direct his pursuits in life. This is a truth known to every man of sense, even to the young. Now then, the soul resembles something seen in a dream or formed in a fancy. The soul is of the nature of air and emptiness, and is never obstructed anywhere in its course. There is an intellectual and astral body which all living beings possess in every place. It is known as consciousness as well as the feelings of our heart. It is by divine will that consciousness rises and sets by turns. At first it was produced in its natural, simple, and intellectual form, and then, being invested with material body, they together make the unity of the person, out of the duality of material and immaterial essences. Now you must know that the triple emptiness composed of the three airy substances, spirit, mind, and space, are one and the same thing, but not so the receptacle, the material body, which has no ability to flow or extend. Know this intellectual, conscious body of being is like the air, present with everything, everywhere, just like your desire to know extends over all things in all places, and presents them to all your knowledge. It abides in the smallest particles and reaches to the sphere of heaven. It reposes in the cells of flowers and delights in the leaves of trees. It delights in hills and dales and dances over the waves of the ocean. It rides over the clouds and falls down in the showers of rain and hailstones in heaven. It moves at pleasure in vast space and penetrates to the solid mountains. Its body bears no break in it, and it is minute as an atom. Yet it becomes as big as a mountain, lifting its head to heaven, and as large as the earth, which is the fixed and firm support of all things. It views the inside and outside of everything, and bears the forest like hairs on its body. It extends in the form of the sky and contains millions of worlds in itself. It identifies itself with the ocean and transforms its whirlpools to spouts upon its person. This intellectual, conscious body of beings is of the nature of uninterrupted understanding, ever calm and serene in its aspect. It is possessed of its intellectual form from before the creation of the visible world, and being all-comprehensive as emptiness itself, it understands the nature of all beings. It is as unreal as water in a mirage, but by its intelligence it manifests itself as a reality to the understanding. Without this exercise of the intellectual man is as nothing as the son of a barren woman, and as blank as the figure of a body seen in a dream. Rama asked, "What is that mind to which you attribute so many powers? What is that which you say to be nothing? Why is it no reality and something distinct from all that we see?" Vasistha replied, "All individual minds are provided with these faculties, except those whose minds are engrossed with the air of the outer world. All worlds are either of a longer or shorter duration, and they appear and disappear at times. Some of these vanish in a moment, and others endure to the end of a kalpa age. But it is not so with mind, whose progress I will now relate to you. There is an unconsciousness which overtakes every man before his death. This is the darkness of his disillusion, Mahapralaya Yamini. After the shocks of delirium and death are over, the spiritual part of every man is regenerated anew in a different form, as if it were roused from a state of trance, reverie, or swoon. Just like the Spirit of God, for its recreation after the dissolution of the world, assumes his triune form with the presence of Brahma and Virat, the universal form, so every person after his death receives the triplicate form of his spiritual, intellectual, and corporeal being. Rama said, "As we believe ourselves to be reproduced after death by reason of our memories, so must we understand the recreation of all bodies in the world by the same cause. Hence there is nothing uncaused in it." Vasistha replied, "The gods Hari Vishnu, Hara Shiva, and others, having obtained their disembodied liberation at the universal dissolution, could not retain their memory to cause their regeneration. But human beings, having both spiritual and intellectual bodies entire at their death, do not lose their memory of the past, nor can they have final liberation like Brahma unless they obtain their disembodied state, which is possible to all in this life or hereafter only by the edification of their souls through yoga meditation. Birth and death of all beings like yourself are caused by their memory, and because they lack disembodied liberation and eternal salvation. The individual soul, after its pangs of death are over, retains its consciousness within itself, but remains in its state of unconsciousness by virtue of its own nature. The universal emptiness is called nature, prakriti. It is the reflection of the invisible divine consciousness, chit prativabham, and it is the parent of all that is dull or moving, jada jada, which are produced by their reminiscence or its absence, the former causing the regeneration of living beings, and the latter its cessation as in inert matter. As a living principle or animal life begins to have its understanding, it is called an intelligent being, which is possessed of its own consciousness. It is added to its organs of perception and conception, all from their elements residing in an empty ether. Next, this minutely intelligent substance is joined with the 5 internal senses that form its body, and which is otherwise called its spiritual or ethereal body, the astral or subtle body. This spiritual being, by its long association with the external senses, comes to believe it as ordinary senses, so it finds itself invested with a material body as beautiful as that of a lotus. Then seated in the embryo, it rests in a certain position for some time, and then inflates itself like the air until it is fully expanded. Then it thinks itself to be fully developed in the womb, like a man dreams of a fairy form in his sleep and believes this illusion is a reality. Then he views the outer world where he is born to die, just like one visits a land where he is destined to meet his death, and there he remains to relish its enjoyment as prepared for him. But the spiritual man soon perceives everything as pure emptiness, and that his own body and this world are only illusions and vain nothing. He perceives the gods, human dwelling hills, and the heavens resplendent with sun and stars to be nothing more than homes of disease, debility, decay, and ultimate death and destruction. He sees nothing but a sad change in the nature of things, and that all that is living or inert, great or small, together with the seas, hills, rivers, and people of this earth, and the day and nights are all subject to decay sooner or later. The knowledge that I am born here of this father, and that this is my mother, these are my treasures, and such are my hopes and expectation, is as false as empty air. That these are my merits, and these my demerits, and these the desires that I had at heart, that I was a boy and am now young, are the airy thoughts of the hollow mind. The world resembles a forest where every being is like a detached tree. The dark clouds are its leaves, and the stars its full-blown flowers. Walking men are its restless deer, and the aerial gods and demons its bird of the air. Broad daylight is the flying dust of its flowers, and the dark night the deep hiding place of its grove. The seas are like its stream and fountains, and the 8 boundary mountains are its artificial hills. The mind is its great water reservoir containing the weeds and shrubs of human thoughts in abundance. Wherever a man dies, he is instantly changed to this state, and he views the same thing everywhere. Thus everyone rises and falls constantly like the leaves of a tree in this forest of the world. Millions of Brahmas, Rudras, Indras, Maruts, Vishnus, and suns, together with unnumbered mountains, seas, continents, and islands, have appeared and disappeared in the eternal course of the world. No one can count the number of beings that have passed away, are passing, and shall have to pass hereafter, or those who are in existence and have to become extinct in the unfathomable eternity of Brahman. Therefore it is impossible to comprehend the stupendous fabric of the universe in any way except in the mind, which is as spacious as infinite space itself, and is as variable as the course of events in the world. The mind is the empty sphere of consciousness, and the infinite sphere of consciousness is the seat of the Supreme. Now know the whirlpools and the waves of the sea are the same elements as the sea in which they rise and fall, even though in their impermanence they are not of the same durable nature as seawater. So the phenomena is the same as its conception, though none is a reality. The ethereal sphere of heaven is only a reflection of the intellectual sphere of the divine mind, and the bright orbs of the sky are like gems in the bosom of Brahman. Its vault is the cave of the mind of the Eternal One. The world according to the sense in which I take it, as the seat of God, is highly interesting, but not so in your sense of its being a sober reality. So meaning of the words I and you, according to me, refers to the intellectual spirit, and according to you to the individual soul and body. Hence Leela and Saraswati, being in their empty astral bodies, were led by the pure desire of their souls to every place without any obstruction or interruption. The spirit of consciousness has the power to present itself wherever it likes, on earth or in the sky, and before objects known or unknown and wished to be known by it. It was by this power that they could enter into the tent of the prince. Consciousness has its way to all places and things, and over which it exercises its power of observation, reflection, and reasoning to their full extent. This is known as the spiritual and unconfined body, the subtle body, astral body, or mind body, whose course cannot be obstructed by any restriction whatever.